Let me hit record first. We're gonna start off with a little video, just a little funny little piece of satire about the garbage problem. And that's gonna be our first topic of the day, looking at waste. So we'll watch this minute video from my favorite TV show, Futurama, and then we'll dive into it.
Ah, just as I thought. The answer lies in this movie I found on the internet.
New York City, the year 2000, the most wasteful society in the history of the galaxy. And it was running out of places to bury its never-ending output of garbage. The landfills were full. New Jersey was full. And so, under cover of darkness, the city put its garbage out to sea on the world's largest barge. The repulsive barge circled the oceans for 50 years, but no country would accept it, not even that really filthy one. You know the one I mean. Finally, in 2052, the city used its mob connections to obtain a rocket and launch the garbage into outer space. Some experts claimed the ball might return to Earth someday, but their concerns were dismissed as depressing.
Wow.
So I'm sure you guys never thought you'd be watching videos from the creator of The Simpsons. Oh, yep, there it is. During a science class, but the reality is that's a surprisingly accurate take on the problem of waste. Not just here, though we'll learn the problem of waste here is substantial. It's a pretty good take on waste everywhere. We are, and as this picture shows you, we are an extremely wasteful planet, right? And waste is sort of the opposite end of sustainability, right? So wasteful is throwing things away without any intention, typically, of reusing them. And we sort of think about the little Futurama video, and it's accurate from a waste standpoint, but it's also accurate from like hey, let's try to do something about it. And they propose something absolutely crazy, like blasting a ball of trash into space, which if you've never watched Futurama before, the ball of trash eventually comes back, just as a note. That's how the episode ends. It comes back and they have to save the day because your problems eventually come around and bite you in the butt, right? And so crazy solutions like that aren't, are sort of more forward thinking than what we're putting forth. And that episode of Futurama came out in 2001, I believe, or 2000, one of the two, and talked about being the most wasteful society of all time, and that really hasn't changed to 2021 as a whole. So, and the final thing I'll sort of say, for those of you that have ever watched Futurama, you know that in the future, the show is set in the future in the year 3000, where they have adopted actually what I'm going to suggest that we do to handle the garbage problem, which is be extremely efficient, be very sustainable about our garbage, recycle everything. So again, I'm sure you never thought you would be watching clips from a cartoon show from the creator of The Simpsons, but it is what it is. I got one more for you later in this class, just as an FYI. So we got one more Futurama video. So to keep on the train of being silly, we have this picture. I'm sure most of you recognize this. If you were, I guess maybe you don't. Maybe if you watched Disney cartoons when you were a kid, the movies and such. This is the Mad Hatter. He's from Alice in Wonderland. And so if you saw like the Tim Burton ones that are kind of weird, Mad Hatter was in those too. But fictional character from the world of Alice in Wonderland. Keep him in the back of your mind. Why is he called the Mad Hatter? You don't need to, I don't want anyone to answer me now or anything like that, but why is he called the Mad Hatter? And why am I bringing up the Mad Hatter in today's lecture about waste? So this lecture is divided into really sort of three parts. The first, we're going to talk about hazardous waste. Then we're going to talk about solid waste. And then we're going to talk about solutions for waste. But the last part is by far the shortest because there are no real good solutions for waste at this point in time, at least not ones that we're willing to adopt, I should say. So we're going to start off by actually talking about a fishing village called Minimada. I'm not sure if that's how you say it, but that's what it looks like to me. So that's why I'm going to say it. It's a relatively small town in Japan. It's off the Yakushiro. Again, my pronunciation is terrible, but the Yakushiro Sea in Japan. So it's modern times, it's a relatively populated area, but but no, not as like clearly not as popular as something like Tokyo. But this city back in the 1900s, so we're thinking early 1900s, like turn of the century, it was a relatively poor fishing village. They lived by the sea. They made their living from the sea. It's a pretty common thing, right? That's why so many people like to aggregate by the sea, because the sea provides, right? So they were, again, mostly a fishing village. Eventually, in 1908, a company called the Chiso Corporation opened up a chemical factory in Minimada. He's in Minimada, and they're originally producing synthetic fertilizers. But then eventually, as plastic sort of came to be, they started actually ramping up to produce and solely produce acetaldehyde. Now, we didn't really talk about acetaldehyde during the microplastics class because we talked about enough stuff during that class. So I didn't need to add one more thing to the plate, of course. But acetaldehyde is basically used in the manufacturing process of plastics. It's a pretty common ingredient, makes plastic stronger, does all sorts of stuff. So they were making a plastic byproduct, or a product that goes into plastic, I should say. So I think the stage is really set. We have a large town. We have a large ocean, a chemical factory, and a fishing village. I'm sure you guys can see where this is going. I don't think it's a surprise. Now, by 1932, the Chiso Corporation had ramped up productions to 210 tons of acetaldehyde per year, and by 1951, they had ramped up to 6,000 tons per year. So they were churning out lots of acetaldehyde. Now, of course, this is not very much by modern standards. By modern standards, 6,000 tons is not a lot for a large factory. They're producing hundreds of thousands of tons. But for 1951's time, 6,000 tons is pretty dang good. Now, one of the aspects of production of acetaldehyde, which doesn't quite happen anymore, but some places around the world still do it, is mercury, which it's a pretty damn cool element, is involved in the production of acetaldehyde. Now, mercury is a wild and wacky element. So its atomic number is 80 in the periodic table. Now, mercury is pretty cool. It's liquid at room temperature. It was historically used in thermometers, so not really in your generation, but I remember when I was younger, we would use thermometers with mercury to take our temperatures. But mercury's got all sorts of crazy properties for electronics and plastics and all sorts of stuff. So mercury is a really awesome manufacturing thing. But as I'm sure most of you know, mercury, like all heavy metals, is toxic. And just a side note, there's two classes of metals out there. There's heavy metals, which like mercury and lead and gold are a part of. They just have they're very massive in size. And then you have light metals like, say, lithium, which are just very small in size. So if you ever wonder what heavy metal means, it's not something like intrinsically bad or anything. It just refers to the size of the metal. That's all. But mercury is a heavy metal, very much like something like cadmium or like zinc or copper or gold, heavy metals. And as you guys probably know, heavy metals are no good. They're not good for you. They're certainly not good for the folks at Flint, Michigan, and they're certainly not good for the wildlife that are exposed to these heavy metals as well. Now, there's an important thing about mercury. Now, elemental mercury is toxic, but it's really only toxic if you ingest via your stomach large quantities of it, or you inhale vapor of mercury. And we'll talk about the inhalation of the vapor of mercury in a moment. So mercury, just as its normal self, not super, super toxic. Again, toxic, but it gets worse for mercury because once mercury escapes into the environment, our microscopic organisms, so our bacteria, they see the mercury and they say, ooh, that's toxic, and I'm going to get rid of that. And they do that by actually doing a process called methylation, where they convert regular garden variety mercury into a compound called methyl mercury. Now, methyl mercury is no joke. Methyl mercury is one of the most toxic substances naturally found in the environment. It is super duper toxic. So methyl mercury is no joke. So that's what we're dealing with here. The Chiso Corporation was producing lots of mercury. That mercury, as you probably can guess, was being dumped out into the ocean. And once it was in the ocean, the bacteria there saw it. It was bad for them. They converted it into methyl mercury. So this is what we have, methyl mercury, and we have lots of it, right? If we're making 600,000 tons of acetaldehyde, that means we have a lot of mercury being used, hence a lot of methyl mercury. And just sort of a final side note about methyl mercury. There's another type of mercury. It's called ethyl mercury. If you drop the M on methyl mercury, it's just ethyl mercury. The medical term for ethyl mercury is actually thimerosal. And so you guys might have heard of thimerosal before. It's used in like long-term flu vaccines, and it used to be used in all vaccines, but people made a stink about it. So we actually don't use it anymore. But ethyl mercury as a compound, as a preservative is great, but ethyl mercury is not really toxic, not the way methyl mercury is. So just wanted to make mention of that. The sort of the compound of mercury, yes, is toxic, but it really matters the form of mercury that is toxic. So just wanted to put that out there because a lot of people ask me about that when I talk about mercury, because people always like to say, you know, it's why vaccines are bad or whatever, but it's just simply not the case. So fast forward about 20 years after the ramp up in acetaldehyde production, and thus the production of methyl mercury, lots of weird things began happening. And they first started noticing them in the animal populations. So they're seeing, you can actually look at these, you can find these pictures and videos. It's actually kind of sad, so I don't recommend doing it. That's why I have a still here, you know, a still photograph. But they were reporting that cats were acting really crazy, and they would actually report that cats were committing suicide, like jumping off bridges, you know, jumping in front of cars, that sort of thing. And it appeared that the cats were trying to commit suicide. But the cats overall were just displaying some really odd behavior. They were also noticing that our canine friends were starting to disappear. They would walk off and never come back, and obviously they would die, right? They were noticing that birds were flying and they were falling dead from the sky. And then they were also noticing that in their fish hauls, they were finding lots and lots of deformed fish, sometimes with 3 heads, multiple sets of fins. They were also finding massive fish kills. So you would go to the beach, and on the beach there'd be lots and lots of dead fish. So the wildlife is suffering. So something is wrong in 1955 Minimada. Fast forward a year later, the problem seems to have migrated to humans. So in 56, so April of 56, a 5-year-old girl actually reported to the factory's hospital in Minimada, where she had difficulties that can be really described as neurological in origin, right? Difficulty walking, speaking, and she was suffering convulsions. And they also, around about the same time, you know, maybe a month or so later, 8 other girls were found to experience the exact same problem. And originally they saw this problem, and they didn't really connect 2 and 2 together between what was happening in the wildlife and in their patients. But they originally thought, well, it's spread among multiple people, it's probably a pathogen. So they called it Minimada disease. They isolated the people thinking that it was a pathogenic organism, like a bacteria or a virus or a fungi. However, by later that year, despite the fact that they had isolated these children in October, so just 5 or 6 months later, 40 patients had been diagnosed with Minimada disease, again, just displaying these symptoms. And of those 14, about 35% died, or 14 out of 40. So it's a pretty high mortality rate. The most, just to put that in perspective, like the most deadly diseases that we know of are like Ebola and like smallpox, and their mortality rates are about 30% too. So they seemed, at least to them at the time, it seemed like a really dangerous pathogenic organism. So we can ask the question, what's happening? Right? What was happening? And I think you guys are smart enough to know what's happening, right? We talked about Flint, Michigan earlier this year, right? Where the people of Flint, Michigan had tainted water with a heavy metal, a different heavy metal, but a heavy metal nonetheless that was poisoning the folks at Flint. Now, for those of you that followed the coverage at Flint, you know that the people that were most affected by the water pollution in Flint was children. And the children were displaying some pretty severe neurological issues, both developmental, just average garden variety movements, as well as just like their behavior. So I think you guys know what happened. The Chizo Corporation that was producing acetaldehyde was dumping their toxic waste, which was chock full of mercury, into the Minimada Bay, and large quantities of that mercury was being taken by bacteria, converted to methyl mercury, and then being uptaken into our fish, the shellfish, and the toxic sludge, i.e. the bottom sediment on the bottom of the bay. And so I think you guys probably already knew that was happening. I'd like to sort of tell the story and pretending like you don't know what happens, but pretty sure you guys probably knew that was going to happen. And when we sort of think about what's going on, we know that it's detecting in fish and shellfish and stuff like that. But as we sort of talked about, when we talked about bioaccumulation, when we talked about plastics last week, what was happening is it was getting into the small things and then getting more concentrated up the food chain. And because humans, i.e. the people of Minimada, were eating shellfish and fish, they were taking in toxic doses of methyl mercury via their food. So clearly the humans aren't drinking water from Minimada Bay, right? We just can't do that. However, they were certainly relying upon the fish and the shellfish for sustenance. So they're taking toxic doses of mercury from their fish. So let's talk about some numbers. Let's talk about some of the sort of symptoms they were observing. So when they actually examined hair samples of victims and Minimada residents, and they compared them to people who weren't living in Minimada or were not eating fish from Minimada, the maximum mercury level that they recorded in the hair of people living in Minimada was 700 parts per million. And if you compare that to non-Minimada residents, that was, almost 200 times, right? It was hugely different between non-Minimada and Minimada residents. So the people in Minimada were clearly poisoned with mercury. Now, I want to say just one quick thing about this 4 parts per million. You might look at that 4 parts per million and go, oh my goodness, those people had mercury in them. You got to remember with a lot of toxic stuff, it's about the amount, right? How much can your liver and system handle, right? And 4 parts per million is not a lot. And then, so the other question I get is, how do people that don't live in Minimada get mercury in their system? The reality is every heavy metal, whether it's arsenic, whether it's lead, zinc, mercury, so on and so forth, is found naturally in the soil. And there's quite a bit of it in the soil. And so anytime you eat vegetables or fruits that are growing in soil, which has all these heavy metals in them, you get a teeny tiny dose of these heavy metals. So I wouldn't worry, I wouldn't freak out about what I just said or anything like that. And don't worry about this 4 parts per million. It's well below a lethal dose. A lethal dose of mercury is in hundreds of parts per million, just as a note. So don't worry about this 4 parts per million, but I wanted to make mention of it because I think it's important to know sort of how these things naturally get in you. I think it's important. So what sort of symptoms were they seeing? Well, we talked about some neurological symptoms, but there's actually several other neurological symptoms that were associated with the folks at Minimada suffering methyl mercury poisoning. Now, the interesting thing about these symptoms, they're actually pretty common across all metal poisonings. So if you got poisoned from gold, for instance, if you got poisoned from lead, so on and so forth, you would display a lot of these symptoms, including muscle weakness, damage to your hearing, vision, and speech, crippling of your hands and feet, paralysis, coma, and eventually death. All neurological symptoms, right? Your muscles are controlled by your neurons, right? So the sort of the takeaway from methyl mercury poisoning here is that, as with all heavy metals, it attacks your neurons first. That's sort of the big thing it does. And that's what makes poisoning by heavy metals a really sort of dangerous thing. Now, in total, the citizens in Minimada documented about 3,000 cases with a mortality rate of 1,800. So they almost had 2/3 mortality, about 55 to 57% mortality. So Minimada disease, i.e. methyl mercury poisoning, was doing a number on the citizens of Minimada. Very, very deadly, quite a few cases, and probably many, many more. Remember, probably every citizen in the entire village of Minimada was affected by this. Just only some of them displayed these variety of symptoms. I have some pictures here. You can sort of see the effects, developmental issues for children, crippling of hands and feet, paralysis. You can see this woman's a little bit developmentally disabled from it. So lots and lots of issues surrounded with Minimada disease. So about 20 years later or so, Japan started paying attention, I guess, or started thinking about what was going on. I don't know, however you want to say it. And they enacted what's called the Water Pollution Control Act, and the law enforced all discharge of all hazardous or toxic substances in all bodies of water in Japan, freshwater and saltwater alike. And they also enacted the Minimada Bay Restoration project, where they essentially dredged the bottom, they cleaned out all the toxic sludge from the bottom, and they got rid of it. And by say they got rid of it, I just mean they put it in a different place where it couldn't harm people. They didn't like magically get rid of it or anything like that. They just put it in a place that wasn't harmful for people. And eventually they reduced mercury concentrations down to 4.6 parts per million. So they did a pretty good job, but the Chiso Corporation kind of got off scot-free here. They wouldn't really have to pay any major fines. And the taxpayers of Japan basically paid to clean up Minamata Bay, which is unfortunate, an unfortunate reality of most cases, right? If we think about oil spills in modern times, while companies like, say, BP get fined, $2 billion, most of the burden of cleaning up a oil spill goes onto the taxpayer of the region, which really sucks. Just as a note. So what are the things we take away from Minamata? Well, Minamata is a great example of what we would call a point source of pollution. I mentioned that during the water class, but remember, a point source pollution means we know exactly where the poison is coming from, where the toxic substance is coming from. So we know it's coming from Minamata's Chiso Corporation factory and nowhere else. So it's a point source, but what we're seeing is that it's a type of what we call hazardous waste. Now, hazardous waste is a pretty broad classification that we apply to chemicals. Simply if they are poisonous, dangerously chemically reactive, corrosive, or flammable, and lots of things fall under the term hazardous waste. Industrial solvents, medical waste, car batteries, ash and sludge from incinerators, coal burning plants, radioactive waste from nuclear power plants, and the list goes on and on. Fun fact, actually, one of the compounds that should be on the list of hazardous waste is actually gasoline, but gasoline is not regulated the same way as a hazardous waste, even though it should be, which I always find, I don't find it ironic. I know why it's the case because of lobbying from the oil industry, but gasoline is a hazardous substance, regardless of what anyone from the petroleum industry would tell you. So, so let's loop back around to the start. Now, I gave you this picture of the Mad Hatter, and the term, his name comes from actually a old English colloquial phrase. And basically, if you said someone was mad as a hatter, you were basically saying that they were suffering from some level of being crazy or insanity or something like that. Clearly not the best way to describe it, right? From a psychological standpoint, that's just inaccurate for people suffering from mental disorders. But that's what they did at the time. So if you ever hear someone say you're mad as a hatter, they're just saying that you're crazy. Now, how did it come to be? Well, for those of you that have seen the, Alice in Wonderland, the Mad Hatter is actually just a hatter. People that are called hatters are just making hats, which is why it's got this wicked sweet hat on top of its head, his head, I should say. And so the cool thing about this is when these hatters used to make hats, one of the things they used to do is heat the hats up to make them more pliable. And then for whatever stupid reason that they thought this was a good idea, they use mercury to make the hats softer. So you can imagine you take mercury, you heat it up, which means that mercury is going to vaporize. And I'm pretty sure you guys know where this is going. If the mercury is vaporized and you're a hatter working on a hat, you're going to breathe in vaporized mercury. And given what we saw from Minamata, with all these neurological issues, I'm sure you piece together that inhaling mercury the way a hatter would do would have some pretty severe neurological issues, leading to someone having a change in their behavior, right? Potentially going, as they used to say, insane, right? So if you ever wonder where Mad as a Hatter came from, or the Mad Hatter came from, now you know. And I'm sure that's probably the only thing most of you will remember from today's class, but I'm okay with that. It's a pretty cool little anecdote. I had it in trivia once. I remember that. Like way back back when I was your age. I remember I had it in trivia at a bar once, and I got the question right. So use this information for the win. So in Minamata, Japan, they cleaned up the bay, right? They stopped the point source solution. But broadly speaking, how do we handle this category of hazardous waste, right? It's bad stuff. Nuclear waste, medical waste, toxic substances like mercury and heavy metals, right? How do we handle it? Well, there's a couple ways. And we'll walk through the three coolest first, and the three that are commonly used, but not as commonly as they should be. So the first is what we call bioremediation, which is basically use bacteria or the enzymes that bacteria produce to break down hazardous substances. So for instance, for those of you that have ever been to Boston, and you've been by the Boston Harbor, and you look out into Boston Harbor, and you see those eight giant white eggs on Deer Island. I don't know if any of you have stopped to wonder what those 8 giant eggs are. They're not actually eggs, of course. That would be a scary size egg. But these giant eggs are bioreactors, and what they do is handle all the sewage and the poo and the pee from the residents of the greater Boston area. And so sewage is technically classified as a hazardous substance because it is harmful to human life and the environment. And so inside those giant eggs, they have these giant tanks that are filled with your excrement and your pee. And inside there, they have billions and billions of microorganisms that are bioremediating all of that sewage to make it safer to then expel several miles off the coast of Massachusetts. So that's a great example of bioremediation. Most wastewater treatment plants across the country have some level of bioremediation. It's very, very effective, especially at treating human waste. Then we have phytoremediation. Now, phytoremediation is a pretty dang cool one where you use plants and algae to remove contaminants from soil and water. So as I sort of mentioned, is how everyone gets a little bit of arsenic and a little bit of lead and so on and so forth by eating vegetables and other plants. Plants such as, as you sort of see here, and, lilies and stuff like that, are oftentimes planted in here as well. They are planted to essentially act as pollutant sponges. They soak up the pollutants from the water, from the soil, cleaning the area. Now, as a matter of fact, plants are less susceptible to most of the toxins, right? Most of the toxins that we think are bad don't affect plants the same way they affect us. So plants can absorb a lot of these toxins and just kind of be fine, which is kind of a cool thing about plants. And so that's phytoremediation, commonly used. You'll see, again, anytime you see like a factory like this, and then you see a pond and it's got lots of plants in it, it's usually a way to detoxify something using phytoremediation. Then we have the final one, which is really cool, and it's only employed at this time by the U.S. Navy. Now, I'm sure you guys probably know our aircraft carriers are gargantuan, but even our small boats are still pretty gargantuan, especially by the standards of, say, an automobile or something like that. But you can imagine if you're out at sea for months and months at a time, waste is a big problem, right? We talked about the Carnival Corporation being jackasses and throwing their trash overboard. The U.S. military has the same problem. What do they do with all their waste when they're out at sea? Well, they developed this cool technique called plasma gasification, where they basically use electricity generated, obviously by the boat, to produce extremely high temperatures. You're talking about thousands of degrees, which is really crazy when you start to think about it. And they basically take all this trash and they basically incinerate it down to basically 1% of its initial volume. So it's a great way of handling trash and volume of waste. And if you watched A Plastic Ocean as a documentary, you saw this little technique. It's really cool thing. So that's what our Navy does. Not, again, only really found in the Navy at this point in time. It would be cool to see it sort of employed at a larger scale, but I don't quite think the technology is there yet for expanded use. So those are the 3 cool ones. Now let's move into the more common ones. The first is physical methods, where we use some sort of filter to essentially pull harmful solids, harmful chemicals out of the water. So, a good example of this is what they gave the residents of Flint, Michigan. Instead of fixing their lead lines, they gave the citizens of Flint, Michigan, water filters for their tap, which is a stupid solution to a terrible problem, but that's what they did. And that filtered out lead and other heavy metals from their tap water. So that's a common way. We use some sort of physical methods. Other methods that we use are chemical methods, where we convert the chemical, say mercury, into something less harmful, right? So maybe it's methyl mercury, maybe we then convert it back to regular mercury so it's less toxic. But as you guys probably would have imagined, the cheapest solution, and given that it's the cheapest solution, it's definitely the most widely employed way to handle hazardous waste, is we just bury all of our hazardous waste, right? Out of sight, out of mind. And that really shouldn't surprise you, right? If there's a cheap solution to handling a terrible problem, that's the solution we take, right? And the Futurama cartoon I gave you earlier, they put their trash on a barge and set it out to sea, right? Cheap and easy problem, out of sight, out of mind. And so the sort of the analogy to modern times is we bury most of the stuff. That's the reality. Is we take it, we do one of two things with it. We inject it deep underground, and I'll show you what that looks like here. So we have this hazardous waste injection wells. We pump this stuff down underground into empty aquifers. So remember, aquifers are just underground pieces of, like mini ponds or lakes or whatever you want to call them. And they hope to store them down deep underground. Either that, they just bury them. As you can sort of see here, you dig a hole, you put your toxins in it, and you cover it with soil, hoping that nothing comes upon it. And so I hope this diagram really illustrates how that's really dumb, right? Because if you're pumping hazardous waste into aquifers, or they're putting it in landfills, i.e. just burying it, it has the potential to get into our aquifers. And if it gets into our aquifers, you can pull it up for water, right? A huge proportion of the world depends on underground water for water. So if you potentially contaminate underground water, which there's a high potential for when you just bury hazardous waste, you really can harm a lot of people. So I'm sure you guys have probably heard of like those forever chemicals, right? That make it into drinking waters, around the state of Massachusetts and around the United States and China and places like that. That's an example of people trying to inject hazardous waste underground to get rid of it, and then it coming back to bite them or bite the citizens in the butt. So that's the most common way we bury it. Now, another common way, you can see it right here. Factories, and I've sort of already mentioned this idea, is that they have these essentially surface impoundment ponds where they basically are supposed to, but most of the time they don't, as you can see. They line them with plastic so that the toxins, when they dump them in there, they don't escape. They don't seep into the ground and potentially make it into these aquifers down here. But as you can imagine, if 70% are unlined, lots of times these little impoundments, they fail and the toxins can make it into underground water sources. Now, why do they do this? Well, it's a cheap and easy way to do it, right? If you just have a pond by your factory, maybe you're in the middle of the desert here, or maybe you're like in a factory here, right? All the waste gets in there and eventually it settles to the bottom and it becomes more concentrated. But if you're a factory, you don't super duper care about that all that much. But if you're a person that lives near this factory, you would care if it gets more concentrated. And so as it gets more and more concentrated, one of two bad things can happen. If it gets super concentrated, eventually some of those toxins will start to evaporate. And once they evaporate out of the pond, they can come down as precipitation, which is bad. The most common thing that happens is when heavy rain falls. You could think of like storms, like a hurricane, or you can think about just a very large thunderstorm, right? Puts large amounts of water into the area, flushes out these ponds, making these toxins spill into the surrounding landscape. So these are really, really terrible at storing hazardous waste, but as is this, right? As is most of our ways to handling. I mean, this as in this. In terms of handling toxic waste. Now, just to sort of show you how bad this can get, for those of you that followed the coverage of Hurricane Harvey, which I didn't really follow all that close, but one of the things about Hurricane Harvey that hit Texas, Houston, a couple of years ago, was what happened to some of these surface impoundments, where this hurricane came through, dumped colossal amounts of water on the state of Texas, and actually caused pretty severe flooding that actually washed out a lot of these toxins from surface impoundment lots in the Houston, Texas area, which led to large parts of the state becoming contaminated with not large parts, but like parts, because Texas is such a huge state, but large parts of the Houston area being contaminated with from the contaminants in some of these surface impoundment lots. So not a perfect solution, but clearly a cheap solution, right? You can hire a guy with a bulldozer to excavate a pond in a day. Right, cost you $1,000 or some couple $1,000. Easy way to store things, but not very effective. Exactly the same way burying it is not very effective. The final sort of method is actually the best way, but it's also the most expensive, is where you get drums, those 55-gallon drums. I'm sure you guys have probably seen them on TV or something like that. And you put your waste in those drums and you bury them and you monitor them over an extended period of time. And this is the best way to store hazardous waste. So this is how they store nuclear waste. It's really, really effective at keeping nuclear waste sort of contained. However, it's very expensive. A good drum like this, you're talking way more than a company wants to invest to handle their toxic waste. And so while it's the best way to do it, it's expensive, right? So companies, you guys know, they try to cut costs whenever they can. So, and the final thing I'll mention, this is not an adequate way to store your hazardous waste. This is just a sort of a picture I found, really showing you like, this is a bad way to use this method. But again, this is what the method looks like. And, I've sort of been showing you pictures of stuff, right? And these don't really look like Massachusetts things. Maybe this one does, but they don't really look like Massachusetts things. They look like things of like the industrial Midwest, or like, heavy industrial areas like China or Singapore or India, right? But the reality is all these storage methods are employed across the state of Massachusetts. So this is just a handy dandy map from our friends at Boston University, where they have what's called the Superfund research program. You guys have probably heard of Superfunds. They're all the red dots across the state, these weird little red stars, but these are areas that are funded by the federal government as massive cleanup sites to handle something stupid we did in the past. Like, for instance, had a coal mine, or we had a metal mine, or something really, really toxic that damaged the area. So these are sites, again, in these red stars all around the state. And then we have a bunch of other different sites, right? We have blue, I was going to say circles, but that's definitely not a circle. Squares, where we have these large hazardous waste generators. We have solid waste incinerators, so those are black diamonds. Then we have hazardous waste sites in orange and red. And then we have landfills in yellow and green. So the reason I'd like to show this map is just to sort of highlight that it doesn't matter where you live, even if you're not a heavily industrial state like Massachusetts isn't very heavily industry focused, you still have lots of ways to handle your waste, because when you have 5 million people living in an area such as Massachusetts, there's a lot of waste that have to be dealt with. The other thing I always notice that when I look at this map is I always notice places I've never seen before. Like, I did not know that there was a Peru, Massachusetts. I didn't know that was a thing, but I always see a new place that I didn't know existed. And actually, the final thing I'll make mention of about this map is you'll notice that they're pretty concentrated around metropolitan areas. So Massachusetts has 3 metropolitan areas: Boston, Worcester, and our friends out in Springfield. And it's no surprising that there's large amounts of things associated with waste around these metropolitan areas. It's the same across every state. So the question we can ask ourselves now about hazardous waste is, what can we do? And the reality with it is that we have to think sustainably, right? And what does that mean? Well, just produce less of it. Right? That's the answer to, I think, most questions in this course. What can you do to solve this problem? Well, stop doing it, right? Produce less of it. And that's the idea with hazardous waste, because it's really hard to deal with hazardous waste. Don't get me wrong, but the key to dealing with it is either using less of it or trying to convert as much of it into less hazardous substances as possible. And when these two fail, put them in long-term safe storage. Don't bury them. Don't put them in a surface impoundment lot. Put them in a safe place so they don't get out. Again, Flint, Michigan is a great example of what happens when we don't handle hazardous waste properly, right? Hazardous materials, I should say. So that's hazardous waste. Now this leads us to the second part of the class, where we're talking about solid waste, which is kind of a misnomer. Now, solid waste is not solid most of the time, which is kind of a, you think to yourself, like, it's called solid waste. Shouldn't it all be solid? Nope. So solid waste encompasses a lot of things. They could be solid, they could be liquid, semi-solids like like a gelatin, or containerized gaseous material. So again, solid waste, not necessarily solid, and it's pretty much everything you think of. Now, hazardous waste falls under the sort of the umbrella of solid waste, but not all solid waste is hazardous. So some hazardous waste that we talked about, industrial solvents, stuff like that. But there's all sorts of stuff that are also solid waste, including sewage, wastewater, industrial solid waste, as well as municipal solid waste, right? So the stuff that you produce: garbage, cardboard, food, cans, yard waste, e-waste, etc. And so solid waste is a huge group of trash, basically. And unsurprisingly, or maybe surprisingly, depending on how you look at the world, the United States is actually the top producer of solid waste globally. Now, the final thing I'd like to say about solid waste is waste as a whole implies that we produce something and then we throw it away. So there is something to waste. But the reality is, when we think about what nature does, right? So, we sort of compare ourselves to nature, where nature is sustainable. What humans typically do is not sustainable. Nature is a zero-sum game, right? It's zero waste. It produces no waste. What does that mean? Well, when something dies, it's eaten by something else, and all the materials of that organism are recycled right back into nature. And we clearly don't do that. So that's keep this idea in the back of your mind of how, sort of in direct contrast, what we do is to what nature does naturally. So as I mentioned, we're number one. Now we're number one not only in terms of total solid waste produced, we're actually number one per capita. And so very much like with climate change, where we produce more CO2 per capita than any country on the planet, we produce the most waste on the planet. Despite having 350 million people, we produce more waste than countries that have 1 billion people, which is absolutely crazy. And I could give you numbers, but I like to, I like to put things on in an American way to think about things. When I think about my waste, I'm sure you guys know, like, they talk about the size of things. They oftentimes say, oh, it's like 10 football fields long, right? So I'm going to put the problem of waste in context like that. So for instance, we know that we could fill with all the waste in 1 year, enough garbage trucks to circle the earth 16 times, or enough tires to circle the earth 3 times, enough styrofoam cups to circle the earth 95 times, enough disposable diapers to go to the moon and back 7 times. We produce 100 billion plastic bags to go to the moon and back 60 times. And we have produced enough carpet here in the United States and throw away enough carpet to cover Delaware, the entire state of Delaware. So where our president is from. And my favorite one, I don't know why it's my favorite one, but it's enough office paper to build a 11-foot wall from New York to San Francisco, which is an absolutely astounding amount of office paper. I can only imagine of how much that office paper was never looked at and just thrown in the trash. So if we ever wanted to build a wall on our southern border, I think paper that we throw away would be a pretty dang good way to make that wall happen, because we produce so much of that paper. Absolutely crazy. So that's our problem. It's astronomical amounts of waste, astronomical amounts of waste. And that's just here in the United States. But the United States is 25%, which means these numbers, we multiply them by 3 to get the full scale of the planet. And you can imagine like how many styrofoam cups that adds up to be. It's astounding. It's huge. So the waste problem, I hope I sort of underscored how massive it is in scope. It's like plastic, right? When we're talking about plastic waste, we're talking about hundreds of millions of tons of plastic every year. And waste is the same exact way. They're both massive problems. They're both global problems. That's the reality of it. And the final thing I'll say about the problem with waste, in terms of numbers, you can imagine this problem has gotten worse over time, right? We produce way more waste now than we did in the 1950s. And you would be right about that. It's gotten much larger over time, and it's projected to continue to get larger over time as well. I'm actually going to skip this one because I don't need to talk about it. Now, this brings us to a component of our hazardous waste, which is actually becoming a huge deal. And it's actually going to be electronic waste, or e-waste. So anything that's electronic, your phone, your computer, your remote for your TV, a blender, anything that has any type of electrical components, which is a lot of things, even maybe things you don't quite think about, is termed electronic waste. And electronic waste is proving to be one of the more difficult things to tackle. And so I have a video for that, because, sometimes just silly videos describe things in ways that I simply can't. So we're going to watch this quick video about the e-waste problem.
New York Times online podcast blog comments editor. Mr. Mayor, isn't this e-waste dangerous?
Not at all, Scoop. Not after it's hauled off to the third world by an expendable team of minimum wage nobodies.
Good news, nobodies.
Greetings, my friends. It shan't take long to strip down your clunker.
There's nothing wrong with our clunker.
Really? Because we can smelt out the deadly chromium to make rat poison and artificial sweeteners.
No thanks. We're delivering e-waste.
Petey, we're halfway done.
This thing is 40% chromium.
Gentle now. Gentle with the hover dumpster. Ready for processing.
What smells like bloody sinuses?
We burn your e-waste down to the usable metals, safely releasing the toxins into our air and drinking water.
Ugh, that's the worst thing I've ever seen.
Really? And don't look over there. Okay, kids, let's play Find the Shiny.
That's even more horrific. Is all the work done by children?
No, not the whipping.
Granted, we later learned some positive things about recycling. But a better solution is to use our electronics as long as possible instead of throwing them out in the first place. I'm going to start by keeping my old cell phone, even if it is outdated.
Hello, Mr. Anga. Your call to St. Louis has gone through.
Well, let's at least throw this TV out. The batteries in the remote are getting low.
No! Put that back and turn it on.
All right. That's the last one, I promise. There's no more Futurama videos. Well, there's other ones I could use, but those are the only three I'm going to use for a semester. So again, another disturbingly accurate piece of satire, because that's basically what happens. And so, you know, it's done as just kind of a joke, but it's very, very accurate. Electronic waste is collected, shipped typically to some country. You know, they joked it was the third planet in the Atari system, but some country where labor is very cheap, oftentimes by children. And then it's simply typically either directly scrapped, either they try to pull all the metals and usable parts that they can out of it, or they just burn it. And as the guy said, play Find the Shiny. So they burn the plastic and stuff away, try to get the metals out. And you can imagine burning plastic. And if you've ever seen plastic burn, and you saw from the video, it burns black. You can imagine burning plastic is bad for health, and it is. So we'll talk about that in just a moment. But the way that cartoon depicts handling e-waste is shockingly accurate. So that's e-waste as a thing. It's hard to get rid of, like it's very hard, but it is an important part of our world, and it's ever growing. This picture of printers and computers from the 90s really sort of highlights the problem, right? And so what do we deal with e-waste? Well, the reality is, again, most of it's shipped to the poorer countries. It is technically banned from landfills and generators, but we don't do quite a good job of handling our e-waste. The United States only recycles about 10 to 15% on a given year. Other countries do a little bit better. So for instance, in the EU and Japan, e-waste actually has to be returned to the manufacturers, where they will either repair it, remanufacture it, or recycle it. So they pass the buck on back to the manufacturers, which is a good thing. So that's our e-waste. Not a particularly awesome piece of waste, but clearly a very important piece of waste. Yeah, so that's e-waste. So what do we do with our solid waste? Well, unsurprisingly, we do the exact same thing with our solid waste as we do with our hazardous waste. We bury it. That's the most common thing we do. And this is something you guys have potentially seen before, right? I don't know if anyone here has gone to the dump or gone to a landfill before, but we just stick all of our trash, all of our solid waste in landfills. Now there's two types of landfills. The first is the sanitary landfill. This is pretty much what's used only in the United States. There might be other types of landfills, but this is by far the most common one used in the United States and the EU as well. And they basically spread the waste as thin layers on dirt, and they cover it with either clay, more dirt, or sometimes plastic foam on a daily basis. And that does a pretty good job. And they cover it for one reason a couple reasons, I should say. They try to keep it dry. They try to keep water from getting into it. So like if it rains, you don't want water coming into this and then washing out. Because again, there's toxic stuff in here. That's no bueno. It also lowers the fire risk. And that's a big deal. And I'll show you a picture of what that looks like later. But it does lower the fire risk. It also reduces odors and potentially access to rodents. So that's, again, what we commonly do here in the United States and in the EU. And this is what this looks like, right? You have this compacted solid waste covered by layers and layers of stuff. And one of the things that they do with these is they actually oftentimes have methane gas recovery wells. So as I sort of discussed in the climate change lecture, food waste produces a lot of methane. And that food waste, as it produces a lot of methane, will start to build up into landfills. Now, methane is just natural gas. So you guys know that natural gas is flammable. And so to sort of prevent things from catching on fire. That's why they bury it and they try to suppress it as much as they can. But some companies, such as Waste Management here in Massachusetts, they actually have these pipes that grab the methane gas, the natural gas, and they use it to power their factories and stuff like that. So that's what a landfill really looks like. Sort of this. I'm not going to really go into all the other parts of it. You can take a peek at it at your leisure. But again, the key part is they try to cover the landfills to keep them as sanitary as they can. Now, the most common way in places like Central and South America, Africa, and Southeast Asia, so the poorer regions of the world, they have just open dumps, so non-sanitary landfills. And I don't know about you guys, but these look like scenes out of like a future apocalypse movie where people are picking through trash because they're trying to find stuff because the world has ended. But the reality is these clearly are just pictures. And you have these, again, these sort of apocalyptic looking scenes where people are picking through garbage. You can see the garbage is on fire, right? That's from all the methane produced in these garbage heaps that catches on fire, sometimes setting the entire patch of garbage on fire, which you can imagine is really, really bad for the people that live in that area. Remember, burning plastic is bad for your health. But again, this is what they look like. These, again, really, really awful looking scenes. And they clearly pose lots of health issues if you're picking around these places or you're exposed to the fire from these things, but they're also just not that great from an environmental standpoint, right? There's nothing to keep a huge rainstorm from coming in here, washing toxic things out of these things or washing this trash out into the environment. So while this is not the perfect solution, this is clearly even less of a perfect solution. So it's really, really bad. Now, though, sort of the final way we actually handle our solid waste is what we call waste to energy incinerators. Now, these are pretty cool. This is a picture of one of them. I forget where it's from. I always forget to look it up. I always forget. And basically what they do is they burn trash. They use steam and heat. They use the steam to generate electricity to heat spaces and produce produce electricity. And that's pretty cool. Right? You're taking a waste problem and you're making energy from it. So that's a better thing than just burying your waste, I guess. Now, the United States doesn't have a ton of these, but there's about 115 of them. And they incinerate about 9% of all municipal waste in the greater United States. As you saw, Massachusetts had 9 of them. And we're a relatively small state. So they are common, but not super duper common at all. Now, the cool thing about these is while they do produce greenhouse gases, you can imagine burning trash and food releases carbon dioxide. You'd be absolutely correct about that. So it does contribute to climate change. But landfills, as I showed you in the climate change lecture, actually emit more greenhouse gases than a waste to energy incinerator. So they technically are better for the environment in terms of climate change than just landfills. And the reason that is it's just because of methane. The landfills produce methane. These energy incinerators don't produce methane. Thus, the incinerators are better. However, you guys probably know when you burn something, you have ash, and when you burn trash, you have toxic ash, and so that's really, really bad. And what you do with that trash, that ash, I should say, from your trash, it depends on the incinerator. But again, we don't handle our toxic waste very well, so you can imagine this is still a problem. And then the final thing I'll say about these wastes, as I've been kind of talking them up, but there's still an imperfect solution to this global problem. They burn it and they contribute less to climate change and they produce less, they concentrate toxic materials, but it still facilitates waste production, right? Because it means we're not reusing and recycling our waste, and that's a bad thing. So that's our second part of this class. So that's our solid waste and how we deal with that. We talked about hazardous waste. So let's talk about solutions. Let's talk about what we do. So currently, when you look at some data from the EPA, we have what we do on the right and what we should do on the left. You'll notice we bury and 67%. We recycle and compost about 23%, though that number varies heavily depending on the state, just as a note. In certain states, like for instance, Mississippi, because it's easy to pick on Mississippi. And for instance, in Mississippi, this number is way, way lower. But in a state like Michigan, it's actually much higher, which is a good thing. We incinerate 9%, we reuse 0.2%, and reduce our consumption, our production by less than 0.1%. And that's a bad reverse funnel, right? That's a bad funnel, right? This is it's like upside down pyramid, right? That's a bad one. What we really have to do is invert this, right? We're reducing, reusing are the top two, because that's the key. with any problem we talk about, it's reducing. One of your classmates asked me a really great question the other day after the climate change lecture, and he asked me why did I focus so heavily on reducing emissions? And I talked to him for a couple minutes about why that was the case, but the reality is the best way to solve a lot of these problems we talk about is to simply reduce how much we have. And why is that? Well, remember, the Earth has a finite amount of resource. So eventually we're going to have to start reducing what we do if we're going to survive and keep using the materials like plastic and metals going forward, because eventually we're just going to run out. So that was a really great question. I forget who asked it, but you had a great question, and I wanted to bring it back up here because I thought it was a really great point to make. Because again, we have a finite amount of resources, so reducing is the best way to tackle this problem, as it is for climate change, as it is for plastics, as it is for air pollution, and so on and so forth, reducing. But reusing is also an important part, upcycling, right? Taking discarded materials and trying to make a better use about them, potentially forcing companies to take back their waste, right? Forcing a company like Apple that when you're done with your iPhone, you have to ship it back to Apple and they have to recycle it for you, right? Or you ship it to like, or you buy a computer, you have to ship it back to Dell or anything you can think of. More recycling, composting, and in particular recycling better. As we talked about, recycling is not a great thing in this country right now. And very, very little incineration and very little burying. And remember, because these contribute to climate change. It's not just a waste problem, there's also a climate change problem and a health problem, right? We're tired of, I'm tired of hearing about stories, I'm sure you guys probably are too, about hearing stories about our waterways being contaminated by chemicals that are never going to go away. And we're hearing about cases like Flint, Michigan, right? I'm sure you guys are probably tired, like I am, of hearing about that. And so, as I sort of mentioned, one of the parts of this is more recycling, and that's a great thing. But right now, the recycling industry in the United States is garbage, and I don't mean that as a pun. It's just bad. So we pretty heavily rely upon China for our recycling. But one of the biggest companies, which is called National Sword, is actually pulling back from recycling for the United States. And so you want to read a little bit about this. My favorite news organization, which is NPR. If you don't like NPR, you should start to like NPR because it's awesome. They're the best. They're the best for the news, in my opinion. They really sort of talk about recycling in the United States and why it's such a problem. In particular, why it's going to be such a problem if large countries like China, which employ a lot of low-wage labor to handle our problems, start to pull away. So take a peek at this article if you have a moment. It's a pretty cool read. It's it's maybe like 5 to 10 minutes of a read, depending on how fast you read. Now, recycling e-waste, as we sort of mentioned, is a big problem. Remember, the United States recycles very little of our e-waste. And as that Futurama video showed you, it's really bad for the places who do, right? And oftentimes e-waste is often sold illegally to developing countries where typically children process them, or low wage or sometimes slave labor process these things. And it sort of, as you saw, like Fry joked, "Oh, what smells like bloody sinus?" And that's a pretty common thing. And so just for instance, about 82%, I can never remember how to pronounce this name. I never remember how to pronounce this name in China. Jiu? I'm not sure. So it's just a town essentially created for like processing of waste in China. 82% of the children less than 6 years old suffers from some level of lead poisoning. So these are, recycling e-waste is really bad right now, but it passes the buck on to really impoverished areas of the world. And again, the health effects of this are particularly bad. So that's the sort of the sad state of e-waste. But the sort of solution for e-waste is to force the manufacturers to take it back, right? E-waste is illegal to dump in landfills, but if you can force them to take back their own products, which they should know how to disassemble and stuff like that, and force them to reuse their plastic, to reuse their metals, to reuse their circuitry or whatever, that's the best way to sort of tackle that problem of e-waste. Not to ship it to China where it's out of sight, out of mind, but to actually physically force people to do it. And I sort of already said this, so I'm going to keep moving on. But as with everything, as we sort of talked about plastics and the problem of plastic pollution in the ocean, if there's the potential to make money off of it, there's some economic opportunities that people have uptaken and ones that you could potentially do yourself if you wanted to. There's all sorts of businesses popping up about reusing things, right? I'm sure you guys probably have heard of, Craigslist or OfferUp, a great place to sell your old items and not let them go to a landfill. So they get a second life. There's all sorts of reusable like clothing stores. So like, for instance, when I watch Hulu, I see commercials for the Real Real. It's like a high-end, consignment, whatever you buy, like Gucci and all that expensive stuff that I would never buy, that someone sold to the company and then they're selling to you. So there are economic opportunities to be had around recycling for reusing things. And there's also this pretty cool industry of upcycling wood. So people will go out and find like abandoned shacks like this, abandoned stuff in landfills, take the wood, treat it, make it all nice again, and then make things out of it and sell it and make a profit. So there's always opportunities, economically speaking, to be to solving the problem. And sort of obviously discussed with plastic, you kind of have to monetarily incentivize people to solve some problems that we have, because most people don't do those things, right? Now there's also another cool concept, which is actually the industrial ecosystem, where we actually copy nature. So let's sort of look at what nature does, where nature is a zero waste system, right? If this bird dies, it's either consumed by something that eats it, or it's consumed by like a raven or a bacteria or a mouse or something like that. So remember, nature is connected and it's a zero waste system. That's what's cool about nature. Nothing goes to waste. So let's apply that to the industrial context. So we have this hypothetical example here where we have an electric power plant, and they generate obviously electricity, and they supply electricity for people, but they produce a crap ton of waste heat. And that waste heat can be repurposed in an industrial ecosystem where it's all connected together, where waste heat can go to help greenhouses or pharmaceuticals or fish farming and so on and so forth. Any waste that they produce, such as ash, can be used to potentially produce like something like cement, or if they had calcium waste, they could use to make potentially like wallboard. But they also take in surplus natural gas from oil refineries, right? So this is really nice and well connected industrial ecosystem where there's little, well, I can't say there's no waste, but little waste because it's repurposed in somewhere else. Now think about what would happen normally. This oil refinery, if it had surplus natural gas, would just let it go into the environment if it couldn't find a way to sell it. Or if this waste heat would just be released into the environment, this ash and this calcium sulfate would be released into the environment or released into a surface impoundment, right? So this is a much overall better system, again, to repurpose things that would just normally be buried and forgotten about. And the reality is, you might think, well, this might be a hard thing to implement, and I would agree with you, but there are some pretty stark economic benefits. If you can sell waste heat, if you can sell your waste products, you're much better off financially. And that's for two reasons. One, your waste product gives you cash, which is good. But the other thing is, by getting rid of waste products in a, from a business standpoint, you also potentially reduce the risk of lawsuits. So you can imagine if we have all this ash from this power plant and it spills out into the environment, this power plant is going to be held financially accountable for that. Not as much as they should, of course, but they will be held accountable from some way. And so that means they have less lawsuits, less fines from the state, and so on and so forth. But it also potentially improves the health and safety of their workers, and it also potentially encourages innovation, right? To find either ways to repurpose your ash or to find substitutes so you don't make ash or you don't make too much waste, and so on and so forth. So let's look at two examples of this. Now, the first one is the Intervale Eco Park in Burlington, Vermont. One of my favorite cities out there. Now, this is a pretty cool place because they have a couple things. They grow mushrooms, they grow greens, they have chickens, they have beer. They have all sorts of cool stuff, but you see that they have these products of mushrooms and worms and greens and stuff like that, and bait fish that then gets sold at market. Now they have inputs, of course. They have electrical inputs, water and waste heat that they get, but they go to say give them straw, and which the straw can then be used for chicken bedding, but also the straw can be used to compost, thus giving food to grow mushrooms. They can also have the brewery. They take the spent grain from the brewery. They can give the spent grain to compost, which again can feed into here. And then they have this really nice connected ecosystem where very little, if anything, is wasted here. And again, by taking your waste products and repurposing them for a dollar value, you can save money. You could potentially make more money, but it does require the business to make the investment. And as of right now, the incentive to make that investment simply is not there. It's just cheaper to dig an impound, pond and dump crap in there, because again, if it's cheaper, you're going to do it. But again, it can work not just in Vermont, it also works in Denmark, where they have this power station where, again, it's connected to a bunch of things, including greenhouses, refineries, farms, and so on and so forth. So again, it's a really great way to copy nature, to turn waste, or to say, I should say, minimize waste production as best we can. Because that's the way we're going to tackle this, is reducing and reusing, as opposed to trying to figure out a better way to bury things, right? Because remember, all these things, whether it's water, whether it's land, whether it's oil, gas, whatever, are finite in amount. And so finding a better way to reuse them and reduce them is the sustainable way to go. Now, overall, what should you take away from this? Well, that we waste a crap ton, right? We really do, right? We're a hugely wasteful society globally. Certain countries are worse off than others. We obviously are #1 here in the United States. So it's a bad thing. What should you do about it? Well, the reality is you can reduce your own footprint, right? Trying to, upcycle things, trying to buy things secondhand, doing a better job recycling. And so there's things you can do. But the reality is this is such a colossal problem, especially here in the United States, that it really requires some level of investment in a policy level, right? As with climate change, as with plastics, as with air pollution, these are multidisciplinary issues and require major policy from the federal and state governments to tackle this problem. And so this problem isn't going to go away anytime soon. Waste has been a problem since day one for humans, and it's not going to go away anytime soon. But it is a time where we're sort of getting to the point where our waste is starting to directly harm people, not just here, but abroad. It's something we really need to sort of think about addressing, because, I don't know about you guys, I'm tired of hearing about, my water sources being contaminated. For instance, the town where I live in Easton, Mass, they recently detected these forever chemicals, very, very toxic chemicals in the town's water supply. So it's really, really annoying, because the people that are doing these things are passing the buck onto the taxpayer, which is awful when you sort of think about it. They're reaping profits from these things, and then we have to foot the bill to fix the problems, which is really, really stupid. But I digress. So that's going to be part 1. So that's waste. Part 2 is food. So they're not really connected that much, but I'll ask you guys, would you like a quick break, or do you want me to sort of keep it on? You can let me know in the chat, or you can say it. I have no preference either way. Oops. Eric says keep going. So 100% of people at this time say keep going, because Eric is a trooper. Chip. Duncan says keep going. Sorry about the dogs barking. Yep, that was my dog. All right, so it sounds like we're gonna keep going. Sorry about the dog barking. He was barking at nothing. My other dog went to look out the window, and he associates anything going towards the window as he has to go bark at things. So he's barking at nothing. So I apologize for that. So food. It should be the best topic of the semester, because food is awesome, right? Food is like the best thing ever. Not just from like a sustenance point, but like food is one of the best parts of life, right? Eating an awesome taco or getting bomb pizza, right? But the reality is we're talking about food from a sustainability point. So it's not a fun thing to talk about. And that's the reality of this course, which is kind of a bummer. So let's start off with some quotes that I really, really love surrounding the topic of food. Now, food is directly tied to dirt. And so I have a bunch of quotes about dirt, because I should just say soil. Dirt implies soil is bad, which is not true. But they're from some pretty cool people. Now, the first one is from George Washington Carver. I'm sure you guys probably know he's probably the best inventor of all time, at least in my opinion, because he invented peanut butter, and peanut butter is one of my favorite foods of all time. So George Washington Carver is the man in my eyes. And he said dirt is life. And that's true. And then arguably one of our best presidents, FDR, said the nation that destroys its soil destroys itself. And that's coming from a man who lived through the Dust Bowl, right, in the Great Depression. Helped pull us out of our garbage depression in World War II and all that stuff. So pretty important figure in United States history, recognizing the importance of soil. And then a quote from the Farm Equipment Association of Minnesota and South Dakota, which you would never anticipate them having a good quote, but it's actually my favorite quote about soil of all time. And I've used this quote multiple times when I've given talks at conferences. And those folks said, despite all of our achievements, we owe our existence to a 6-inch layer of topsoil and the fact that it rains. And so today's class, we're going to talk about dirt. We're going to talk about soil because all our food stems from soil, the stuff you walk on. You probably don't think about it very often, but the health of our soil directly affects our quality of our food, how much food we can grow, and it affects our climate, it affects our water, it affects everything. So soil is super duper important. And it's sort of one of the reasons why I've made a career out of studying it, because again, it is so important to our everyday life, even if we don't think about it. And so soil is the name of the game today, food, how they're related, and what we do in terms of growing our food and what growing our food, both animals and plants, do to our environment and to our society as well. So let's dive. Now, what we choose to eat affects more than your own well-being, right? You guys probably know how much food you put in and what types of food you put in your mouth influence your health, right? You eat too much fatty food, you get fat, and you get heart disease and all sorts of things, right? So your food clearly influences your health. Unless you're one of those people that can eat whatever they want and they never get sick and they never get fat. I don't like those people because I'm jealous of them. But your food clearly is tied to your health. However, your food is tied to lots of other things. And so it's tied to, the health of the planet, but it's also tied to the livelihoods of people. And so I like this guy. If you ever heard of the Ron Finley, he's the gangster gardener. He's in South Central Los Angeles. He's a pretty cool dude. You should Google him if you've never heard of him. But he actually started this massive garden, and he did it because he saw people weren't getting adequate nutrition due to lack of healthy food and their overall low income. I'm sure you guys probably know, and we'll talk about this at the end of the class, it's super cheap to go buy a burger at McDonald's than it is to go buy a salad at Panera, right? And why is that? Well, we'll talk about it at the end of the class, but that's what he was noticing. And he took volunteers and some city council members and created what was called the Green Grounds. And he created an urban garden and parking strips, vacant lots, schoolyards, and homeless shelters where he teaches people how to grow food and to prepare healthy local dishes and stuff like that. So some people have taken sort of the role food plays in your life and applied it to, helping others. And then there's the final group of people where growing food is their sustenance, right? So how did modern agriculture develop? Well, you guys probably have heard of the agricultural revolution, right? It's where we sort of revolutionized the way we grow food, right? Now, until about 10,000 years ago, humans basically lived in very small groups. And then modern agriculture came to be and allowed people to stay in one spot, and which led to sort of the development of human society as the way we know it, right? We can live in one spot nowadays and support large populations nowadays, and in the past too, because we have a way to grow food in a confined area and to grow a lot of it, which is pretty cool. Now, we talked about domestication and the role it played in not only the development of agriculture, but also the way we grow our food and how much food we can grow. And I gave you the example of corn. I gave you teosinte is what the ancestor of corn looks like. And then we look at the modern corn, the monster. I love this. I love this figure, as I like the other one I showed you too. But remember, domestication did play an important role in the development of modern agriculture. And it led to the explosion of not only how big our food is, but how much area we can grow, right? Where you can grow enough, for instance, maybe in the past, it would require 100 hectares to feed a person for a year. And then modern times requires less than a full hectare to feed a person for a year. So it's pretty dang important for the development of modern agriculture. Now, what are some other modern agricultural practices that we used? Well, technology is a big part of that, right? Just having good corn to grow is only part of the story. Right? You have to learn how to breed your animals, breed your plants, to domesticate them, to make them easier to grow, to be more nutritious, larger. And we also paired that with technology, right? Plows that are pulled by horses, then they're eventually taken over by mechanical technology in the Industrial Revolution. But other things that you might not think of, like including irrigation, right? Digging ways like to reroute the water from a river to better irrigate your crops. Also fertilizers. So like getting, using animal feces or decaying organic matter from, like plants to add nutrients back to your lands that you're growing your food in. And so lots of cool agricultural practices. And that have existed sort of along the entire history. And you can sort of read some of these things, including, the Pueblos practicing waffle gardening, which is pretty cool, where they kept water close to the plants, or, the Native Americans on the East Coast enriched soils with fish, or maybe the Romans were using what's called fallows, i.e., planting other plants to help restore soil. So we've applied agriculture a wide variety of ways throughout the history of the way we grow food. But modern agricultural practices really take things to the next level. And the reality is, people have called this the Green Revolution. I don't know if I agree with that term. I wouldn't say anything about the way we grow food now is green, but that's what it's called. And the Green Revolution really sort of put technology, both like mechanical as well as biological and chemical, and made it so we could grow food in super duper high amounts. So for instance, put this in perspective, after 1960, it took only 40 years to triple the average grain yields to 6 metric tons per hectare, which if you think about sort of how long it took historically, it took thousands of years historically. But all these crazy technologies, all these large companies putting lots of money into figuring out how to grow more food more efficiently and grow it in places that we never could before. Now, one of the big things is modern irrigation. And modern irrigation is a huge part of why farming is not sustainable the way it's currently done. Now, for those of you that, pay attention to the news, you probably know that the Mississippi River has been and continues to be at historically low levels. And I mean historically low. Now, why is that the case? Why is the Mississippi River at historically low levels? Is it because of climate change? Well, that has some role in it. But the real big one is irrigation. You guys probably know most of our food is grown along the Mississippi River. And most of the states along the Mississippi River draw water from the Mississippi River as their primary water source. And if that's the case, the farmers in those areas, which there's a crap ton of, use water from the Mississippi River to irrigate their crops. And so Mississippi River is at an all-time low, as are many other rivers around the globe, because of extreme amounts of irrigation that our farmers do. Is it a bad thing for the Mississippi? Of course. Is it a necessary thing? Yes and no. We'll talk about that. So that's where we're at. Irrigation puts a huge tax on our water sources. I showed you the effect on aquifers earlier in the semester as well, but the area of farmland irrigated globally is about 20% of all land, of all the surfaces. I'm sorry. Yes. No, sorry. I'm wrong about that. Is about 30% of all the surface on the earth. So farmland is a huge part of our landscapes. You can sort of see this here in the United States, where they have these circular plots where they're growing crops. You can sort of see these lines in the crops. They kind of look like clocks. But these are just modern irrigation systems, where they basically just have these pipes that go into the fields, and they field these little sprinklers that essentially spin around these plots. So irrigation is an important part of farming, and clearly a pretty large tax on our waterways as well. The other big thing, and we do this quite a bit, is actually synthetic fertilizers. You guys probably know, you add more fertilizer to your plants, they grow better. That's just the correlation we have. More fertilizer on a plant, the better it grows. That's just the way it is. And the reality is, the United States leads the way in synthetic fertilizers by far. We use about 30% of all the world's synthetic fertilizers, and the majority of its pesticides as well. The United States uses about 60% of all synthetic pesticides on the planet, which is really crazy, but it is what it is. And our synthetic fertilizers are really a monstrous part about how much food we can grow in a confined area, and it has increased exponentially since World War II. I gave you this little figure of 14 million tons to 177 million tons in modern times. So huge amounts of fertilizer go onto our crops to grow them better. But as we sort of mentioned, lots of fertilizer added to agricultural fields means more nitrous oxide, so more climate change induced effects of agriculture. So it's clearly not a good thing for the climate either. Now, one other aspect of of the way we handle our food is actually the rise of genetically modified organisms, or GMOs. The idea of a GMO has been around for actually a really long time, but modern genetic engineering is actually really dates back to the 70s, where we really more so directly targeted genes of interest and also took genes from other animals and spliced them into our plants of interest. Now, GMOs get a lot of flack. A lot of GMOs are banned in Europe, but all the research to date, both conducted by companies like Monsanto, who have a vested interest to show you that GMOs are safe. So clearly that's not a trustworthy piece of science, but also all the independent science conducted by professors at universities and stuff like that, that's funded by the government, not a private entity, actually show GMOs are overwhelmingly safe. So you should never sort of feel bad or worried about a GMO. There's no worries at this given time that we can even begin to suss out. So GMOs, again, are safe. But why do we care about GMOs? Well, GMOs are good for a couple of reasons. A lot of genetic modifications of plants is focused on adding like nutrients. So for instance, if you guys might have heard of golden rice. Golden rice added vitamin A, a missing component of rice. And so now rice that is golden rice produces vitamin A, supplementing the dietary needs of people who are lacking in vitamin A. But there's lots and lots of other things that we've used genetic engineering to produce, where it's resistant to certain pesticides, to be more drought tolerant, and so on and so forth. But genetic engineering is a really important part of our modern agriculture, and it is a very safe part of our modern agriculture. And I can guarantee you, going forward, it's going to play a huge role in how our modern agriculture adapts to climate change. So stay tuned to genetic engineering. It's going to take off wildly in the coming years. So those are all the technologies, right? We got irrigation, we got pesticides, we got fertilizer, we got genetic engineering. So how does modern engineering affect the environment? And it's not a good thing, right? Clearly, all this technology is a good thing, right? The human population is at about 7.5 billion people and has expanded pretty rapidly after the rise of modern agricultural techniques and technology. So clearly, it's a net positive for population growth. But as we talked about, population growth means the production of more greenhouse gases, more waste, more plastics, more air pollution, more water pollution, and so on and so forth. So clearly, modern agriculture has fueled, both indirectly through population growth, environmental issues, but also directly impact the environment. Now, how does it happen? Well, the big thing is how we actually harvest our crops and prepare our soils for the next generation of crops. When we do cultivate our crops on land, large areas of soil are oftentimes left bare, and those large areas of soils that are left bare, i.e. with no plants, are really subject to erosion. And so you might ask, well, why is that a big deal? Well, this picture over here really does justice to it, where this is a modern day dust bowl in China, where all the soils are really, really dry because they're not cultivated or covered by crops or anything like that. And the wind whips up into these big dust storms. And the exact thing happened in the United States in the 1920s that partially contributed to the Great Depression, or I guess the first Great Depression. I don't know, the original Great Depression. There we go. And so our modern way of doing agriculture makes our soils more susceptible to being lost, either through a dust bowl or just lost because we're mismanaging them, losing nutrients. And that's the reality. The biggest issue of modern agriculture is it's slowly but surely destroying our soils, leading to our soils becoming lost in the cases we see here, but also overall degraded. Now, as we water and water and water more and more of our plants, irrigation leads to more erosion. You guys probably know when you add water to something, it causes it to like break apart, and it can potentially wash away soil. That's very, very a valuable resource. You have to sort of think about soil as a resource, because that's what it is. Right? Those quotes I gave you at the start really highlight the importance of soil as a resource, because again, it is a resource. But ultimately, more and more water leads to more erosion. And as that happens, you lose more and more nutrients, you lose more and more capacity for the soil to grow food, which means you have to add more fertilizers, right? Adding more fertilizers can change the soil pretty dramatically, cause the soil to become degraded. And once the soil becomes degraded, overall, it becomes less better for growing food, but eventually it damages the soil for the long term. And so we lose a lot of soil every year. We use thousands and thousands and thousands of hectares of soil just due to over-fertilization, over-irrigation, and all the other things, in addition of pesticides and so forth, that cause our soils to become damaged and degraded. And as a note, it's really hard to sort of restore a soil once it's been degraded. And we can sort of look at this map. I like this one, which is from the International Soil Reference Information Center, ISRIC. And we can look at the map of the globe where stable soil is pretty much only found in the Arctic, though it's found else places. Degraded soil is in orange, and very degraded soil is our reds. And then without vegetation is just the deserts of the world. And of course, our friends in Greenland, because there's a giant pile of ice. But you notice that the world is mostly on fire, right? Most of our soils have become degraded from modern agricultural processes. It's true in Europe, it's true in the Middle East, it's true in Africa, it's true in the United States. Modern agricultural processes are damaging our soils worldwide. The other aspect of the way we farm is water pollution and air pollution. The reality is one of the sort of the pollutants we talked about in waterways is actually sediment. And agriculture provides most of the sediment that is polluting our rivers, lakes, and estuaries in the ocean. And what does it mean? Well, because we're watering our soils so much more of the soil from our agricultural fields is being washed into our rivers and streams. And remember, all those things eventually make it into the ocean. So the way we water and the way we do our things leads to more sediment making it into our oceans, providing some level of pollution. In addition, about only half of the fertilizer we put on our agricultural fields is actually absorbed by the plants. The rest of it is actually just actually leads to runoff, and it gets put into rivers and streams, and eventually making it to the ocean. And we can actually sort of see some of the other things is when we add fertilizers and pesticides and stuff like that. Remember, we also add other things like plastics, and so we can actually look at just this sort of bleak map because of the color scheme they decided to use of organic water pollutants worldwide. And you can see this is in kilograms per day. And you see the United States and China are dark, where they have 1 million to 10 million kilograms of organic pollutants in their waterways on a daily basis. Other countries do better or less, but clearly, no matter where you are, you're putting a lot of organic pollutants into our waterways, which again, eventually make it to the ocean. And one other big part of pollutants that make it into our waterways is our fertilizers. Now, you might not think of fertilizers as a bad thing, but once fertilizer makes it to the ocean, i.e. say at the bottom of the Mississippi River into the Gulf of Mexico, it induces a really catastrophic series of events. So fertilizer is just mostly nitrogen, and what limits photosynthetic organisms pretty much everywhere on the planet is nitrogen. And so once you add a lot of nitrogen to the ocean, which is only got a lot of photosynthetic organisms in it, and they're limited by nitrogen availability. If you add a lot of nitrogen, it stimulates those organisms to go crazy, they start photosynthesizing like crazy. They produce huge amounts of biomass in short periods of time. Now you might think, oh, that's good. They're photosynthesizing a lot. But the reality is we only add fertilizers in timed events, right? There's only a limit of how much fertilizer we can add, right? We only grow food from May to October, right? So eventually that fertilizer turns off. And what happens when that fertilizer turns off? Well, if there's not enough nitrogen, i.e. the fertilizer, to support all the growth of these photosynthetic organisms in the coastal waters, well, they run out of nitrogen, which means they start to die off. And when things start to die off, all the microorganisms in the water start to eat those dead things. Remember, nothing is wasted in nature. However, if you eat dead things, you start to consume oxygen. And what happens when we have too much fertilizers making it into the oceans, stimulating photosynthesizers that eventually die and then are consumed, we actually start to drive what are called oceanic dead zones, where all the oxygen in large bodies of water, say in the Gulf of Mexico, off the coast of Massachusetts, Japan, China, wherever, is consumed, leading to these areas that have no oxygen. And I don't need to tell you how important oxygen is for most organisms of the planet. You remove all the oxygen in these areas, it creates oceanic dead zones. And so one of the best studied oceanic dead zones is actually the one in the Gulf of Mexico at the mouth of the Mississippi River. And so oceanic dead zones are a big problem. When they happen, they kill millions and millions and billions of organisms in the ocean, completely disrupting the ecology and biodiversity of areas of the world. So these oceanic dead zones from synthetic fertilizers are no joke. Sorry, that was a kind of a long-winded response about why oceanic dead zones are bad, but I studied them when I was in grad school as well. So I like them quite a bit, not from obviously from a practical standpoint, just from a scientific standpoint. So oceanic dead zones are another big problem. But remember, when we put lots of water, it puts sort of a pressure on our irrigation, on our own natural sources of water. Now, the example I gave you is the Mississippi River, right? It's at a lower, the lowest level of all time because of intense withdrawals from our agricultural fields. And again, that's just modern agriculture. However, it's not just lakes and rivers. We can access underground water. And that's what they do in the Midwest. So we've talked about this aquifer already in Nebraska, Colorado, Kansas, Texas, and Oklahoma. This Agala reservoir is actually at really low levels as well, because we can drill down and extract the water. And this area grows a lot of food as well. So they use it to water their crops. Again, I'm not saying this is a bad thing. This is just the way we do modern agriculture. But remember, this is pressures on natural systems, which is never a good thing. And the reality is the rate at which we take, and we sort of already talked about this, so I won't dive too deep into it again, but the rate at which we take from aquifers, whether it's here in the United States or it's potentially aquifers in China, is just simply too much, right? I showed you that picture from California where they've taken so much from an aquifer, it's caused the land to drop by 7 feet, right? We're taking a lot from our aquifers, and remember, they take a long time to replenish, right? Thousands of years. So we're taking much faster from our aquifers that can be replaced. Now, that's water, that's fertilizers. Remember, we have pesticides. Now, pesticides are a really interesting thing. I love this figure. It's awful. Because it's just this group of people, this lady and this cow and this potato and chicken singing DDT is good for me. And it's awful. It's such an awful thing because it's such a great piece of propaganda at the time, of course. But I'm sure you guys probably know DDT is a synthetic pesticide. It was heavily used in the United States all the way up until the 1970s, where it was just flat out banned. If you want to know a little bit more about why DDT is bad and how it got banned, you should read the book called Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. She's an amazing scientist, amazing woman. She'll tell you all about DDT because she helped get DDT banned. But again, DDT, it's a pesticide, was heavily used. Fun fact about DDT, it was so heavily used, it actually drove bed bugs in the United States to almost extinction. And because we stopped using DDT in the 70s, bed bugs have made a resurgence since then. So fun fact, I had bed bugs once, it was awful. But I always thought it's a really fun fact that DDT almost drove bed bugs to extinction here in the United States. But pesticides are an important part of our agricultural system. Insects love our crops, as do plants, right? Weedy plants. They love to grow in our agricultural fields. So weedy plants like to grow in our agricultural field because we give lots of water, we give lots of fertilizer. Weedy organisms love those two things. But insects love our crops as well. They're super nutritious. They're easy to get at. They're in large amounts. So pesticides evolved as a sort of an industry because of the need to essentially keep our crops from being eaten alive by insects. And so they're super widespread. Now they're far more heavily used here in the United States than they are globally, but they are organic pollutants. They are hazardous waste. And so they're very toxic. And so as you can imagine, these pesticides, as we spray them on our fields, make it into our soils or waterways. And if they make it into our soils and waterways, they actually start to accumulate in our organisms, right? They start to bioaccumulate, and eventually humans could potentially eat them. Now, they don't accumulate in plants, I'll tell you that much. So when you buy a piece of plant, say you buy a zucchini, you don't need to worry about the zucchini having the pesticide inside it or anything like that. You should wash off the surface of your things because there might be pesticide residue, but you don't have to worry about the zucchini you eat having pesticides inside it because the plants just don't absorb the pesticide. I just want to put that out there. People ask me that a lot. But the reality is there's two problems with pesticide use. I've already sort of talked about one, right? It gets out into nature, it causes damage to nature, and it bioaccumulates. Has anybody here heard of colony collapse disorder? It's a condition that's affecting our population of bees here in the United States and worldwide. So if you have never heard of colony collapse disorder, it's this phenomenon that's causing a global collapse of bee populations worldwide. Bees are important pollinators for our agricultural systems. Colony collapse disorder has been heavily linked to the use of synthetic pesticides, just as you know. So synthetic pesticides, they're bad for nature. They just are. There's no other way around it. But the other thing that they're bad for is actually, well, actually, it's a sort of a two-part thing. Actually, there's three things it's bad for. I can't put these two things together, sorry. One of the things it does is it makes insects that are resistant to those pesticides. So the more and more you use pesticides, the more likely insects are like to evolve resistance to those pesticides. And that's a big problem. Because what does that do? Well, if your pesticide is no longer effective against a group of insects, it means you have to develop a new pesticide, probably a more poisonous pesticide, which is bad for nature. And the other aspect is of how much pesticides affect humans. The CDC does estimate that about 20,000 of about the 2 million farm workers in the United States do suffer from pesticide poisoning each year. And there are many, many citizens that also suffer the effects of pesticide poisoning on a yearly basis. So pesticides are important, but again, they pose a pretty distinct threat to biodiversity, our pollination, but also human health as well. Now, genetically modified organisms, again, are not inherently bad, right? They're not toxic to you, they're not toxic to us, but there are some issues around the use of pests of genetically modified organisms. Now, in the United States, GMOs constitute about 88% of corn and 94% of soybeans in the United States that are grown. Now, the most common type is actually what we call Roundup Ready, which are GMOs that actually have a series of genes inserted into them that make them resistant to a type of pesticide. I'm sorry, herbicide, so something that kills plants. Because these plants are resistant to this herbicide, the farmers can dump large amounts of it to kill any weeds and grow more of their, say, soybeans or corn on these places. So that's the reality of one of the things we're seeing, but sort of the ethical issues around this are sort of multifold. Now, one of the ethical things around GMO plants is that they are patented. So if Monsanto, for instance, found that you were growing one of their plants in their field, either accidentally or on purpose, they could sue the crap out of you because it's a patented piece of technology. So that's one ethical issue of GMOs. The other issue is that the more and more we use them means the more and more pesticide and herbicide we spray, which means we're more likely to see the evolution of resistant weed strains, which means we're going to have to find new pesticides, which again are already a bad thing. So GMOs, again, they're not bad for you. They're not going to change your DNA. They're not going to give you puberty early or anything like that, but they do have some issues environmentally as well as like societally that do need to be accounted for in some way, shape, or form. Now, one other aspect of modern agriculture is actually how few things we grow. Now, one of the things about the agricultural revolution is that we started only growing a very small amount of plants, leading to what we call genetic erosion. Now, we can I love this figure, and so it's 1903. It's not always 1903, but it's early on in the growing. You see that we started off with lots and lots of varieties of these important crops: radishes, peas, tomatoes, so on and so forth. And you see in modern times we grow very few varieties. Now, remember, biodiversity is important, right? It's important for nature, but biodiversity of crops is also important for the agricultural system. And I'll give you an example of why that is. So back in the 1950s, this is one of my favorite stories, by the way, so I'd love to tell the story. But back in the 1950s, there was a type of banana that was mass grown that was apparently extremely delicious. Like, it tasted like ice cream. But it was a big banana. It wasn't one of those blue bananas that taste like ice cream. But apparently it was really delicious, really sweet. Basically always tasted like a caramelized banana, which if you've never had a caramelized banana, I recommend you do. They're awesome. And so we had this awesome species of banana that we were growing. However, a fungus, the fungus is called Fusarium. It doesn't really matter what it's called, but I'll just give you the name anyways. It's a really common agricultural pest, just as a note. Fusarium moved in and basically wiped out most of the banana crop. And farmers couldn't figure out how to get rid of the Fusarium. So what happened is that instead of trying to solve the problem of the banana, right, try to figure out a way to get rid of Fusarium, they just grabbed another species of banana, leading to the modern variety of banana that we have today. So we dropped a variety of banana from our group of bananas that we grew because it was not able to be grown in a mass setting the way we grow bananas now. And instead we chose a species of banana that was resistant to this fungus. The ironic part about this whole story, which is why it's one of my favorite stories, is that same fungus is making a comeback to kill the variety of banana that we know today that we find in stores. So the reduction of agricultural biodiversity might not seem like a big deal, but we have lost significant amounts of agricultural biodiversity through time because certain things are just easier to grow. It's easier to make money off of, right? People don't grow food for the fun of it or just out of the goodness of the heart. They grow it to sell it. And if you can use a species or select varieties of species that are easy to grow and make you the most money, farmers are going to do it. And then the final thing about agricultural biodiversity, that's maybe you might not think it's a big deal, but it's actually what we call monoculture growth. Monoculture growth is when we have a field, and in that field we only grow lettuce, and that's bad. And it's bad for a couple reasons. Growing the same crop over and over and over again damages the soil, but also means that a monocrop of something is more likely to need pesticides. Because if you grow a field of lettuce or a field of corn, you're more likely to invite a group of insects that will demolish that entire field. Because growing individuals, growing one type of thing in a field, while it's better for harvesting, is actually invites more insect pests, more weeds, which means more pesticides need to be used. And as we discussed, pesticides are no bueno. So that's like plants. And there's lots more that we could discuss on this, but those are sort of the big topics I want to hit. Now, I want to talk about one of the most emerging problems with agriculture, and that's meat. It's meat. And meat, it's been a part of our society forever, right? I mean, humans are omnivores, right? Our guts and the microbes that associate with us and our digestive system was designed to eat meat and plant material all together. So that's what our gut was designed for. And so meat has been a part of our lives since day one. But as you probably know, the way we grow meat for sustenance has changed dramatically. And so since the 1950s, we shifted away from like happy cows and fields to what we call CAFOs, or concentrated animal feeding operations, where these industrial livestock operations, where we grow thousands upon thousands of chickens or pigs or cows in an area that is way too small. And why is that the case? Well, it's like growing the same type of crop, right? Same way as we do monoculture. It's easier. It's more cost efficient to do that. So we can look at the expansion of meat production over time. So this is total meat production in millions of metric tons per year. And you can see it from 1961, we're starting to enter kind of like this little J curve. But you'll notice that the total production of meat, this is not like that they consume it, but just total production is led pretty heavily by Asia, Europe, and North America. But other countries are starting to expand their production, including South America, which is really taking off as a place to grow beef, in particular fueled by Brazil and Argentina as places. But again, the way we grow cows is less of happy cow in a field and more of sort of a apocalyptic sort of scene where we stuff thousands of chickens into a tiny barn, and that's our CAFO, which is kind of a bad thing. Now, why is meat consumption rising? Why is the production of meat rising? Well, the appetite for meat is growing, not just here in the United States, where we eat the most meat per capita. We eat about 2.5 kilograms of, we eat about 25 kilograms of meat here in the United States per person per year, which is a lot of meat, just as a note. And the appetite for meat is growing worldwide. So the production of meat worldwide is also growing. So let's talk about chickens. Now, CAFOs, so these confined animal operations, began actually with the chicken industry, where the industry would bred chickens that are called broilers. So if you go to the store, you go to a restaurant, and you get a chicken, they're called broiler chickens. Now, why Why are they called broiler chickens? I forget. You can Google it. But broiler chickens are enhanced with animal protein, so they're fed other animals. Now, normal chickens are usually just fed grain, but we feed our chickens, our broilers, proteins, feed them vitamins, minerals, amino acids. We also pump them through full of antibiotics, which we'll talk about in just a moment. And so as a result of this, we just kept packing chickens more and more and more into a tight space. But it did a couple things. Now, these graphs, I'm sorry, I didn't expand them enough. I apologize, they're hard to read. But you see we have growing time. You see over time, the growing time of our broiler chickens has dropped from 16 weeks down to 8 weeks. So we can get our chickens to maturity faster. But by the time they reach maturity, they're also much larger. They basically doubled in size since the 20s. We can see the percentage of chickens dying before maturity has also dropped precipitously, again, by about half. And the efficiency of feed, i.e., how much bang for your feed buck do you get, has also dropped precipitously as well, again, about halving. So the way we're growing chickens and the food we feed them and the things we give them in addition to food has enhanced how much meat we get, how long it takes to grow them, how efficient our farms are, and lessen the amount of chickens that die. And so these CFAOs, which have been great for people to grow chickens, have done a lot to change sort of the way we grow them. And clearly chickens are an important part of the diet of millions and millions of people across the planet. But again, we're changing the way we grow them and putting it in a much more industrialized setting, because that's what really a CFAO does. It's an industrial way to grow flesh. And the other thing I'll say about CFAOs with regards to chickens, and I'm not going to dive too much into it, but you should take a peek if you have a chance about the way large chicken corporations like Purdue or Tyson actually grow their chickens. They don't actually grow the chickens themselves. They actually sell chickens to farmers, and the farmers have to grow the food, grow the chickens for them. They could sell the chickens back to Tyson, but it's a heavily regulated industry. And actually, because of how awful that industry around commercial chicken is, chicken farmers have one of the highest suicide rates in the country, which I know sounds awful, but I don't want to get too much into it because I'd get mad. That's one of the things I get mad about. So if you want to know more about how CFAOs for chickens work, just Google a little bit about how Tyson or say something like Purdue works. It's a really, really sort of not so fun thing for both the chickens and the people who grow the chickens. Now, pork production, same thing. Lots and lots of hogs in a confined area, which is awful. But you can see this sort of field in Nebraska where you have this giant pile of food and you have all these tractors getting the food, and you have all these lots where the pigs are packed in, way too many pigs per acre, and they're fed lots and lots of food. They get pretty large. Now, starting in the 90s, we actually started doing artificial insemination. In the 90s, we used artificial insemination about 7% of all of our pigs. But fast forward 10 years after that, so the year 2000, basically every pig in the entire United States or China that's grown actually shows a pretty dramatic effect of artificial insemination. We don't let our farm animals breed naturally anymore. We artificially inseminate them to produce more and more of them, which is kind of a crazy thing. And the other thing this does is actually most pigs come from the same set of genetic material. So they use the same hogs because they have desirable characteristics to inseminate a wide variety of female hogs. So it's kind of a bad thing for pork production. We're both reducing genetic diversity of our pigs, which is, as we talked about, is bad, but also we're packing them in like sardines, like pig sardines, which sounds kind of funny, but it's clearly a terrible thing when you look at it. And then we have the beef production. Now, we talked about how bad beef is for land use change, right? Remember, in Brazil alone, there's thousands of fires started every day to clear the forest to grow more beef. And the United States is similar, right? We've converted about, I think the statistic is about 35 to 40%, I might be wrong about that, of all the arable land in the United States is just dedicated to having cows. So cows are really sort of taking over. Beef is a very, very popular thing, obviously. Now, cows are a little bit different from pigs and chickens. They have to be raised in a field first for the first 6 months, and then they are moved to those CAFOs, where they have these monstrous feedlots where they're fed a corn-based diet with soybeans, fat, and protein, which are commonly from slaughterhouses. So they oftentimes will feed cows corn mixed with animal protein. So cows, naturally being herbivores, are oftentimes fed animal protein, which is not good. And they're also fed a lot of corn. Now, corn is really bad for cows. I'm sure you guys have probably heard that corn will cause ulcers in cows, and that's actually true. And so corn in the diet we feed them is really, really bad. Now, we also feed a lot of other things, including growth promoters like Xylemax, and it boosts the muscular production in about the final 3 weeks before slaughter, and they add about 30 pounds of meat to your average cow. And the other thing I'll just make mention of is how effective this was for the production of cattle. Now, in the 1950s, it took about 3 years to raise a steer for slaughter, but with the CAFO, we cut that by about 60%, and it only takes about 14 months to have a calf become large enough to sell in slaughter and all that stuff. So not the best production either. Again, we grow cows in very much like pigs in scenarios like this, large amounts of them in very, very small pace. Now, this leads us to our final category of protein, which is seafood. Now, we talked about the effects of over harvest, right? Taking overfishing and stuff like that on fish populations. So that's one aspect of it. Remember, we catch a lot of fish, and part of catching fish is actually bycatch, right? Accidentally catching something else. And bycatch leads to astronomically high amounts of accidental deaths of fish populations worldwide. There's billions and billions of fish are accidentally caught and killed in nets when we're trying to catch things like salmon or tuna or anything like that. Now, that's one aspect, catching wild animals. Now, global stocks of fish are at all-time lows. It doesn't matter where you go. They're at all-time lows because we take so much. And our capacity to catch more and more seafood is owed to a couple different things. So technology like sonar and GPS and 3D mapping, as well as helicopters, but also our understanding about the biology of these fish, where they're going, when they're going, what they're eating, also drives our capacity to catch more and more of them. Again, leading to lower fish stocks overall. Now, the other thing we're actually starting to see is more and more aquaculture. Now, certain fish we can grow in aquaculture. For instance, like, oysters are really easy to grow, mussels. Lobsters we're incapable of growing in aquaculture, as salmon we grow in farms as well. There's some fish and shellfish we can grow in farms relatively easily, but not so much for other ones. And so CFAOs have also spread into aquaculture from the idea of growing beef and chicken and so much. Now, the question we can ask is, are CFOs sustainable? And the answer is a resounding hell no. They're not. Nothing the way we grow fish, nothing the way we grow cows, and so on and so forth, actually is a meaningful way to grow these organisms sustainably. You might argue that we've never been able to grow them sustainably, but I think, given how large our population is now and the way CFAOs work, we certainly are way farther away from sustainability than we've ever been. Now, what are some problems with CFOs? Well, there's lots of them. So we oftentimes see organic dust from their feeds, beddings, pesticides, making it into our atmosphere, polluting waterways, polluting people. We also know pesticides, their fertilizers get out to the environment, causing terrible things, right? Colony collapse disorder in bees, oceanic dead zones, and so on and so forth. So the things they use are bad for the environment. We've talked about how bad they are for water sources. So that's one bad thing. But the reality is, the one other aspect of what growing animals does is waste. CFAOs produce 1.3 billion tons of manure every year. And to put that in perspective, that is 40 times the mass of human waste produced at publicly owned waste treatment facilities in the United States. So our animals produce again, this is not a pun, just going to say the word, it's a crap ton of waste. And it's a problem. What do you do with that much waste? And given what I just talked about in last class, you can imagine we don't handle that waste very well, and we don't, which is awful. Now, another issue of CFOs is actually the spread of disease. So you guys probably have heard of things like swine flu, right? Bird flu. Where did those come from? Or potentially, if you guys saw a couple of years ago, Chipotle shut down for an entire day to teach their employees how to properly handle food because they had an outbreak of E. coli. And I'm sure you guys have probably seen recalls of foods because of salmonella or enterobacter on food. CFAOs invite, because of just the nature of how tightly packed these animals are, bacteria and viruses to spread and proliferate. And raw foods that have some level of animal origin have caused 48 million cases going to say that number one more time. 48 million cases of foodborne illnesses every single year in the United States. And of that, close to 10%, 3,000, are fatal. So the way we grow food, you can imagine if there's 48 million cases of foodborne illness, how much that puts a tax on our healthcare system, how much lost work that does, right? How many lost days of work, and how many people's lives it ruins. And that's just a result of the way we grow our food. And so conventional meat production is not sustainable at all. There's lots of reasons, lots and lots of reasons. From the destruction of our soil, to pesticides, to oceanic dead zones, to diseases, the list goes on and on. The way we grow food now is not sustainable. It is awful. There's no other way to say it. It's awful. And that's not even accounting for how unethical it is to grow 10,000 hogs in a place this size. So there's lots of ways that growing your food is unsustainable. And the other thing I'll mention is, as I mentioned with the chicken farmers, it also places a huge burden on our farmers. It really does, mental burden. Now, one of the other areas of agriculture our CFAOs invites is actually antibiotic-resistant bacteria. This is one of my favorite parts about this talk, and it's only one slide, which stinks, but it's one of my favorite slides. Because if I were to make it more slides, I would talk for an hour about it. But one of the things that we do is we feed our livestock, in particular cows, lots of antibiotics. Now, there's this weird thing. We don't quite understand why it occurs. But when you feed a cow antibiotics, it grows larger. It grows faster. As far as I know, and I check all the time because it's a really fascinating idea, we don't understand why it's the case. But when you feed a cow penicillin or tetracycline or any of the antibiotics out there, they get larger. However, the more and more you use an antibiotic, the less effective the antibiotic comes, because bacteria, remember, antibiotics only affect bacteria. They don't affect viruses or fungi, just as a note. So just want to point that out. The more and more you use an antibiotic, the more likely an antibiotic resistance is to pop up. Now, what does antibiotic resistance mean? Well, it means an antibiotic is no longer effective against the species of bacteria that it was targeted. It was essentially found to be effective against. So lots of these antibiotic-resistant bacteria exist. Now, one of them you might have heard of is called MRSA, MRSA. That's short for methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. It's a really nasty skin infection and one of the most common hospital-acquired infections. MRSA came to be because of the overuse of the antibiotic methicillin. So the more you use the antibiotic, the more likely bacteria are to evolve the capacity to be resistant to it. It's an exposure thing, right? What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. You can apply that idea to bacteria. And so because we give our livestock antibiotics to make them grow better, that sucks, Joe. Joe dumped in the chat. I don't know if you guys can see the chat, but Joe said that he had a staph infection when he was in middle school. That's awful. Staph infections are awful. So I do not envy you, Joe, for your middle school staph infection. However, what I will say about these antibiotic-resistant bacteria is that they're coming up more and more common because we're giving cattle antibiotics when they don't need the antibiotic. We're only doing it because it makes farmers more money, which is awful. And so we're spreading antibiotic resistance around our country, around the world, because we're giving it to our cows for no reason other than trying to make a profit. And that is the most capitalistic thing that I've ever said in this class, because one of the problems with antibiotic resistance is once it gets out there, it doesn't go away. And one of the biggest issues facing our world right now is climate change, obviously, but one of the other big issues is antibiotic resistance. We're getting to the point now, we're actually about to enter what's called, we're actually in the middle, we're actually just starting to get into, I should say, into what we call the post-antibiotic era, where antibiotics are actually no longer going to be effective against most of the common pathogens we see. And it's actually going to make things like common surgeries, like for instance, I had a root canal at the beginning of the summer, which would have made my root canal basically not accessible to me because the antibiotics simply wouldn't work anymore. So we're sort of on the precipice of this apocalypse where diseases that we could normally cure with antibiotics, like tuberculosis or staph infections, are simply not going to be curable because we've used antibiotics so much. So that's all I'm going to say about that. If you want to know more about that, I recommend Googling it. It's a big issue. Or if you want to talk to me about it after class, I'll talk your ear off. But I'm going to move on because I'm going to keep talking about it because I think it's really cool. So antibiotic resistance is a big problem, in addition to all these other problems that I previously discussed. Now, as the other thing I mentioned is when we produce seafood, we overfish by quite a bit. So I like this figure because we have fisheries in Alaska, California, and you see all the percentages of fishes that they catch are actually just discarded back into the ocean. So what does that mean? Well, they catch these fishes in their line, and the fish die in the line. And instead of taking the fish and trying to sell them or repurposing them, they just throw them right back into the ocean, which sounds really stupid, right? But that's what they do. And so bycatch kills billions of fish all around the world. Again, just because we're trying to catch tuna, or we're trying to catch swordfish, or we're trying to catch something that's tasty, and we catch these other fish that we don't think are tasty, we kill them and we throw them back. So overfishing is a huge problem because it does two things. It not only limits the population sizes, but it also actually weakens the genetic traits of species. Because if you take a huge amount of species, say billions every year from populations around the planet, you reduce genetic diversity. You reduce potentially biodiversity as a whole, which, as we talked about, is a bad thing. Now, there's some cool stuff coming out now. So there's a company called Aqua Bounty. Yeah, Aqua Bounty, sorry. I looked at it and I thought it said Bunty, but it's Bounty. They've actually developed the first GMO fish, and they actually targeted salmon. Now, what they did with this fish, they took genetic material from Pacific salmon and an eel-like fish from the North Atlantic to allow it to rapidly grow. And they grow these salmon in aquaculture, right, in a tank, to applying GMOs to grow these fish faster in a synthetic setting, so that this idea of overfishing and bycatch is a little bit less of a problem. However, the big issue with a lot of these fish that they worry about is actually what happens if they get out. We don't really worry about cows getting out or chickens getting out, but fish easily escape. And we're worried, one of the things they're worried about is what happens if these GMO salmon get out? Would they just completely displace the wild populations of salmons, which we do not want to happen, because that's a bad thing. But that's a story for another day. So what's the story globally? What does our food production look like globally? Well, together, when we add up croplands and pastures and feedlots from CFOs, our planet is covered, of the land, about 40% is dedicated strictly to growing food, which is kind of crazy when you think about it, right? 40% of our planet is dedicated to growing food. And the reality is, the vast majority of people on this planet, I think the number is about 95%, get all of their calories from only a handful of foods. You're talking about things like wheat and corn and rice. Most of your calories come from those, either directly because you consume them, or indirectly because we feed them to, say, a cow or a chicken. And so our global food system taps upon a limited number of not only species and varieties, but also we tap a limited number of locations. So United States, most of our produce comes from the Midwest, as well as our friends in California. California is always crazy. They produce so much food, and they also do all sorts of other stuff, which is kind of a weird dichotomy, but I digress. But globally, remember, we've seen a massive decline in the varieties of crops. And remember, we get we get most of our calories from a very few varieties of plants. Now, let's think about this in terms of food security. What does this mean now? And what does this mean going forward under a thing like climate change, right? The reality of it is, it's not a good picture. Now, think about if we grow corn or soybeans, our limited varieties of these plants, if they don't do well under future climate change, the problem of food insecurity simply grows. And food insecurity is already a huge problem. I like this little graph, the percentage of students in the United States that go to public colleges, private colleges, and universities and stuff like that, where they have what percentage of those students are food insecure. Now, Bentley falls into this category as a 4-year private college, but even private colleges, which typically are much more expensive than, say, public colleges, they still have a huge number of students that have experienced some level of food insecurity. But like, for instance, like at a school. I've taught at UMass Boston and Roxbury Community College, and I've had multiple students throughout the years just have to drop classes because they had to work more because they simply couldn't afford the bare necessities, including food. So our agricultural production, while crazy, still doesn't really solve the problem of food shortages either here or abroad. But again, when we think about this in terms of a long-term resilience of our crop system, our lack of food biodiversity is a troubling scenario, as I sort of highlighted when I talked about beer and coffee and wine, in terms of crops that are expected to dramatically drop with the effects of climate change. Now, the other problem that with food is, too little food is obviously really bad, but the problem that we face in the United States, and this affects about 25% of us, myself included, is overnourishment, right? Too much food, like way too much food, leads to obesity. And you guys probably know obesity shortens your lifespan by about a decade, depending on where you are, of course, and brings a cascade of health problems: cardiac, pulmonary, neurological, and so on and so forth, diabetes. That puts a huge sort of tax on our healthcare system, which is already globally pretty damn taxed. So overnourishment's a bad thing. But part of the reason overnourishment occurs, and not the only reason, of course, but part of it is actually all how we process our food. And as we'll talk about in a moment, how we subsidize our food. And so we can actually sort of see the growing portion sizes here in the United States, where, a burger 20 years ago was half the calories as it was today, or a pizza is, less calories than today, or a muffin, right? So we're seeing more and more processed foods, larger portions, and that again contributes to a huge problem of consumption. Again, it's not just here; it's a global problem. It certainly is a big problem here because if it affects 25% of your population, it's a huge problem. But it's a problem worldwide. And so to put this in perspective, about 100 years ago, the average American eats 60% more sugar, double the amount of fat, and 3.5 times the amount of salt than it did 100 years ago. So clearly, this is not a sustainable scenario, because think about what this does for the food production. If I have bigger servings, and that's what I expect as an American or a European, that means I need to grow more food, which means puts all the things we've talked about today into a greater sort of stress on the environment and our food system as a whole. So that's sort of the issues with food consumption. More and more and more synthetic foods, processed foods, and we're actually seeing a pretty heavy shift in percentage of consumption. And so we can look at this graph. I like this graph quite a bit, where we have food at home in this dark blue line. It's declining over time since 1987, and food away from home is increasing. And food away from home actually means like processed foods from like Wendy's and McDonald's and Chipotle and stuff like that. And so we are seeing a shift in our culture as well. But again, part of it's driven by our portion sizes, and also how easy it is, right, to go to Wendy's and get a burger as opposed to cooking a healthy meal at home. And this leads us to thinking about, well, how do your food choices link to sustainability, right? How you choose your food is important for a wide variety of reasons, right? It affects, the spread of antibiotic resistance. It affects the welfare of animals. It affects climate change. And, the reality is that our food choices are becoming really important, right? They're becoming a pretty ingrained part of our culture, right? Especially as, it becomes more politicized, I see things all the time on like, say, Twitter or something like that, of, people talking about, how they hate, vegetarians, or they only eat meat and they do it to own the libs, or, something stupid like that. And it's become a cultural thing. And so we see that not just in a political sphere, but we're also seeing it in our entertainment. So for instance, celebrity chef Jamie Oliver actually has a show based on a food revolution to promote healthier diets, again, to try to counteract this. But also seeing the New York Times, there's a food writer called Mark Bittman. He's a pretty cool dude. Not that I've ever met him, but I like to read his stuff. He actually has a food ethic concept, I can't think of the word, that focuses on reducing meat consumption due to environmental impact. So your food choices are directly linked to sustainability. But, in terms of all the problems we've talked about this year, the reality is that your food choices actually matter quite a bit, and you have the capacity to influence the food choices of those around you. whether or not you realize it or not. And so you do have, unlike climate change or plastics, where it requires large government intervention, food choices are a cultural thing. So potentially getting your mom to, for instance, I got my mom to try oat milk for the first time the other day. And she likes it, which is good. But getting her to shift away from bad things, less sustainable things, that's something you have the capacity to do. But there's another thing is about actually where we eat on the food chain, right? So we like to eat high on the food chain, right? But when we think about sort of what that does, the reality is like eating high on the food chain means we certainly get a lot of energy, but it also requires way more inputs. Eating vegetables, which is a vegetable only diet, which is something you could certainly do, or maybe eating a low meat diet or whatever, actually requires less energy, both from fossil fuels, both from inputs to the agricultural system, than eating a cow. And I like this little graph where if you eat just vegetables, you say you require 1,000 units of energy to feed this entire group of people. But if you think about how much energy it's required to feed a cow and how much energy we get from the cow, it simply just doesn't add up, right? The energy flow up the food chain implies that we really need to eat more at the bottom of the food chain, less animal-based things. Again, because of how inefficient it is to grow a cow, to grow a chicken. It's more energy efficient, more climate change efficient, sustainability, so on and so forth, to eat at the bottom of the food chain. So I'm not advocating that you do anything today. It's not my job. My job is just to sort of show you the science. You can do this information as you please. But that's the reality of it. From a energy perspective, eating a burger, while it's awesome, or a pepperoni pizza, equally as awesome. Actually, I think pepperoni pizza is better than burgers, but that's just me. Sounds awesome and tastes great, but it's a really inefficient use of what you do. Now, the other aspect of it, and what has actually driven a lot of people to become like vegan or vegetarian, is actually animal welfare. The worst group of people that do this is actually PETA. For all the good that PETA has tried to do over the years since it became a group, they've done so much to harm the image of people that try to help animal welfare and all the other terrible things they've done to animals in the process. So don't ever look to PETA as a beacon of hope in the idea of animal welfare. They're, for lack of a better word, just a bunch of jackasses around it. But as we discussed, CFOs are terrible for animal welfare. This is not a natural way to grow pigs. Chickens that grow in these tiny, tiny cages causes all sorts of bad things, health, birth defects, heart and lung issues, and it's really an ethical thing, right? And it really varies based upon the country you're in. Some countries and some cultures value animals more than others, and so this scenario doesn't exist or exists very little. And then you have other cultures. You can think of like Texas. Texas is a great place to pick on because they grow so many damn cows and pigs there, where they don't really care about animal welfare all that much. But again, the way we grow food places not just problems for humans and the environment, but it also hurts the things we grow. So just some food for thought. Just some food for thought. Again, I'm not advocating that you do anything, but I'm just sort of telling you the reality of things, because it's not my job to tell you how you should live your life, right? I'm not gonna as my dad liked to say, I'm not gonna indoctrinate you with my ideas as a professor. I'm not doing that at all. It's my job just to show you the facts. Now, let's talk about organic farming, because organic farming is a really interesting type of farming. We're trying to get away from CFOs to grow more food. And reality is organic farming is becoming more and more popular. It's becoming it's already a multi-billion-dollar industry, but it's growing every year because people want food that's better for animals. They want food that's better for the environment. And the reality is the effects of organic farming, they're not as widespread, but they could be, because the reality is, you don't have to sacrifice much in terms of profits to grow things organically, because organic foods right now sell for a much higher premium. You can oftentimes grow slightly less food than growing conventionally and actually sell it for more profit. So organic farming is becoming more and more popular. There are no direct health benefits. So there was a big meta-analysis that came out a couple of years ago that actually showed there's no health benefits from eating organic. Organic has no pesticides and other stuff like that. So there are no direct health benefits of eating organic, but it does impact the environment less. And the other thing about organic farming that people thought was a thing, but actually isn't a thing, is actually organic farming is worse for climate change. To grow a bushel of corn requires more land, typically speaking, than conventional farming. So because you use more land in organic farming, the impact of climate change is more for organic farming than it is for conventional farming, which is really weird, but that's just what the science tells us at this point in time. So organic farming is great. It's better for the environment. It's better for our soil health, which, remember, our soil health is super duper important, and might not be better for climate change, but we could do other things to help with climate change. So organic farming is great. It's certainly more expensive right now than conventional farming in terms of buying the product, but it might be a thing to sort of think about the next time you go to the grocery store. Maybe that bunch of bananas, the organic ones, are maybe only an extra $1. Maybe you pick up that or something. I don't know. Again, I'm not trying to tell you to do anything or anything like that, but that's sort of where we're at. And the other thing is actually buying local, right? Food production is a big issue globally. And the United Nations does estimate that about 75% of those that suffer from hunger do live and work in farming communities. And so fair trade, I'm sure you guys have probably heard that, is a sort of this hot topic. Starbucks does it, where you have to essentially pay customers an adequate price for their goods and do things more environmentally sustainable in countries that are suffering from these things. So it's kind of a big deal in Africa and Central and South America, where corporations normally would just reap all the profits by ripping off these poor people. But with fair trade, it actually requires that you pay them a decent wage and not harm the environment too much. So global equity is an important part of food production. It's still lagging behind where it should be. And the other thing is actually buying local. And so one of the costs of sort of a climate change cost of growing food is that, yeah, it's great to get an avocado in the middle of winter or a strawberry in the middle of winter. But the reality is, for you to get that avocado in the middle of the winter, or that strawberry or that pomegranate in the middle of the winter that's out of season, it means it has to travel really, really far. And so there are issues with where you get your food. Local stores, local food is generally the best. It's the most climate conscious thing. It's more than oftentimes, well, about 50-50 shot off being organic. So oftentimes growing food locally is pretty good. And the other final thing I'll say about agriculture is helping people get out of poverty. So trying to make more global equality. Getting communities to be more focused on their agriculture is actually a great way to not only help communities get out of poverty, but it's actually also one of the best ways to help women sort of even the playing field and sort of help advance in countries where they're kind of maligned as a cultural norm, unfortunately. So kind of a great thing about agriculture. It's good for equity. It's good for potentially helping people. But when you think about your own plate, it's also a good thing for really trying to help people get out of poverty. So food is an important part. Food waste, as we talked about, is a big deal. Food waste is the third largest country, right? If you added up all the food waste globally, it produces more greenhouse gas emissions than India, right? A population of 1 billion. And the reality is, globally, about a third of the food that we grow goes to waste. And that is awful, considering there are 2 billion people on this planet that are hungry every single day, which is crazy. Now, in the United States, more than 60% of the food waste, because we as consumers buy food that we don't end up eating, right? I might like broccoli, but if I buy a frozen pizza, I'm going to want to eat that frozen pizza first, and that broccoli sits in the fridge and goes bad, and I throw it away. And there's two aspects to that. Now, there's lots of people in the United States, about 5 to 10% of our country, depending on the year, is food insecure. Severely food insecure, I should say. And so all that food waste in the United States is bad, and it's bad for the climate, but it's also a huge dollar tag. It's about $165 billion every year in the United States just from food waste. That's how much the American consumer loses. It's great for manufacturers and grocery stores, but terrible for our pockets, right? Given the fact that, most of us live, close or near the poverty line, that's not a good dollar figure. Right? That's a lot of food waste. So food waste is a big deal for climate. If we reduced our food waste, that means we could reduce agriculture intensity as well, which means we could be more sustainable. Now, the other aspect of what we're doing in terms of growing food is our soils. Remember, as I talked about, the more we do to our soils with fertilizers and watering and pesticides, we're destroying our soil. And our soil is globally on decline, as I showed you with that map. But the reality is, the way we can help our soils is a couple ways. Now, conserving our soils is relatively easy. If we limit our number of fertilizers and we give the fertilizer instead, use less synthetic fertilizers and use more organic fertilizers. So add like manure or potentially like plant-based fertilizers to our fields. That can help alleviate some of the issues we see with soil. Also, watering less can help with our soils. But the big thing is actually how we grow our food, right? If monocropping our food is bad, that destroys soil. But if we do a crop rotation where say we go corn one year, soybeans the next, alfalfa the next, then back to corn the following year, and we kind of rotate, that's one of the best ways to actually keep our soils healthy. And that's a big problem, is keeping our soils healthy. Because if we don't keep our soils healthy, we're going to see terrible scenarios like the Dust Bowl again. And like they're seeing that in China already, which is terrible, given how big China's population is. But the Dust Bowl here is a huge problem in the United States, and it's projected to happen again and again and again, given the way we grow our food. And that's a terrible thing. And then the final thing I'll say about our soils is actually fixing our soils, restoring them, trying to fix the way we do agriculture actually might be one of the best ways to tackle climate change, because our soils have tons of carbon in them. And as we fertilizers and irrigation, we make our soils less of a carbon sink and more into a carbon source. So restoring our soils could be a great way to stop climate change, but it's a certainly great way to make our soils more sustainable, not tragedy of the commons, our soil. That's what we don't want to do, because that's a bad thing, right? Obviously a bad thing. Now, the final thing I'll make mention of is how we subsidize our food, dollar bills. So the question we could ask is, why does a salad cost more than a Big Mac? And I like this little pyramid because it really talks about why that is. Now, some areas of our agricultural system are not profitable unless they get some sort of subsidy from the federal government. And so every year or every couple of years, we sign the Farm Bill. You guys might have heard of that one. It gets tripped up in Congress all the time for political reasons. It's absolutely stupid, but that's just me being angry. So that Farm Bill subsidizes our farmers, but the reality is the subsidies aren't evenly distributed. 73% go to subsidizing meat and dairy, grains, so like wheat, 13%, sugar, oil, starch, and alcohol, about 11%, nuts and legumes, fruits and vegetables, less than 2% apiece. That's the way we subsidize our farms. And the reality is, by subsidizing our farms, the farmers get money, and that's good for the farmers, especially small farmers. But remember, most of our farmers are CFOs, right? So we're oftentimes subsidizing large corporations, which sucks. But because we subsidize, that means the crops can be sold at a lower price point, which is good for your consumer, right? If you live in a poor area of this country, subsidizing crops makes them affordable for you. However, because of the unequal distribution for this, it actually makes certain foods more out of reach for a lot of people, and makes other ones easier. So this brings back, why does a salad cost more than a Big Mac? Well, the Big Mac is heavily subsidized. So McDonald's can sell it for dirt cheap. But if you want to go to Panera, right, where only 0.37% of all of our farm subsidies go to do things like vegetables and fruits, right, such as strawberries and lettuce and spinach, well, that's going to be more expensive because there's less money, taxpayer money, coming from the government to subsidize our vegetables and fruits, which drives up the cost of a salad at Panera, or even a salad at Wendy's or McDonald's, right? Wait, does McDonald's have salads? I know Wendy's does. I don't know if McDonald's does. Making a burger cheaper than a salad. But if we sort of look at this in contrast to what the federal government and the FDA recommends, they actually recommend basically almost no sugar, oil, and salt, so using it sparingly, a decent amount of protein, but mostly fruits and vegetables and grains. And so our subsidies don't line up with what we should be intaking, because we subsidize the bad things more than we do the good things, right? 83% of all our subsidies go to things that we're not supposed to have very much of, as opposed to going more towards the things that we need and are healthy. So if you're someone that's very, very poor, say you make the minimum wage, right? Pretend you make $7.25 an hour. That's the federal minimum wage, of course. Massachusetts, it's what, 13 or 14 bucks. But Massachusetts cost of living is high, so it's still a bad wage. It's easier for you to go to McDonald's to buy a Big Mac from the dollar menu, because that Big Mac is so heavily subsidized, as opposed to going to the store and buying a head of lettuce and buying some stuff, right? You can get way more at McDonald's for $10 than you can at, say, Big Y or Stop and Shop when it's fruits and vegetables. So the food inequality problem of the United States is driven partially by the way we subsidize our foods. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't subsidize our foods. We absolutely should. Food is a basic human right. If you can't afford food, someone should help you get food. No one should go to bed hungry. That's just a matter of principle, right? No one should be hungry, right? And no one shouldn't be able to afford food, and no one should not be able to afford food. That's just bullshit. I don't care what you think about that. That's absolutely bullshit. And so we should think about how we subsidize our food. Now, would the meat and dairy industry be mad at us? Yep. Would people in Texas be mad at us? Absolutely. However, we should really shift away from the way we subsidize food, subsidizing healthier foods, because if we subsidize healthier foods, they become more affordable for the people that can't afford them normally, and we can potentially solve issues of malnutrition that we see in this country, but also otherwise. Now, this brings us to the final thing. What can you do? I've given you a bunch of things, a bunch of knowledge over the course of this class. You do with that information as you wish. Like I said, I'm not here to tell you what to do. That's not my job. My job is to tell you what the science is, what your food system looks like. That's my job. Now, do I get angry at things? Of course I do. That's just human nature. And that's just who I am as a person. I'm just very passionate about the environment. However, what should you do? Well, if you care about sustainability, if you care about animal welfare and all the things we talked about today, eating more grains, eating more organic is certainly the way to go. And there's all sorts of things out there like choosemyplate.gov. The Monterey Bay Aquarium has this really cool seafood watch guide and apps that provide the best choices for seafood consumption that are more sustainable. There's all sorts of things online. There's all sorts of bloggers, influencers, blah, 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 chefs that have sustainable food options and give you pretty decent information. But remember, the way we grow food is directly tied to the sustainability of our environment. It's directly tied to the biodiversity, both in our crop system, but as well as naturally. And that all ties directly into a wide variety of topics that we've covered, whether it's climate, air pollution, water pollution, plastics, waste, and so on and so forth. So that's our food system. And so remember, food is an important part of your life, and your food choices can influence what others make. And so you do have the potential to make an impact on other people's lives if you care. But again, it's not my job to tell you what you should do. This is the sort of the science behind it. So that is going to be it. So I'm going to stop recording now.